All right, well, welcome everybody. I'm glad that you're all here this evening for the first of our Spring Speaker Series lectures. Our guest tonight is Jason Hawley, who is a fantastic astrologer. And I'm going to say more about Jason, introduce you to him a little bit, and we're going to get into a fascinating exploration of Ceres tonight. And I was actually just reading something that Jason wrote today online in a conversation that was related to tonight's talk, and Jason was saying that Ceres has been classified as a dwarf planet, which I actually did not know, and that it happened at the same time that Pluto was demoted to a dwarf planet. And there was some interesting observations and things like that Jason made about that. And it was brand new to me. And I'm hoping that, like many other people, you're like me, you're sort of fascinated by asteroids and dwarf planets and sort of other objects in the solar system that aren't necessarily, the most known or used. Like you grew up, you cut your teeth on like the traditional planets plus Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto, but the rest is sort of a mystery. That's kind of where I'm at, and so I'm really excited. Because the Winter Speaker Series, we had Demetra George come out and give a talk on a wide variety of she did a talk on the asteroid goddesses. Ceres was one of them, and a lot of people's interest was really piqued by a little bit of the insights that we gained on Ceres. So I think tonight's going to take us further in that direction. So this should be really fun, but let me tell you a little bit about the Spring Speaker Series, the Speaker Series in general, where you are right now if you've never been here before, and other good stuff. So my name is Adam Ellenboss. I'm an astrologer, and I run a one-year-long study program in ancient astrology. I call it Ancient Astrology for Modern Times because it's really about building a kind of a bridge between ancient Hellenistic astrology and other classical forms of astrology and modern forms of astrology. So as I teach that year round, I open up a speaker series to the public as part of the program every season of the year. And so this is our spring speaker series where we host 3 speakers. And usually what I try to do is to bring in topics that are brand new to me, that I don't know anything about, that I'm not necessarily qualified to teach, and voices that I find really interesting, astrologers and individuals that are really unique, that bring something interesting to astrology, to the learning process, not just based on the topic, but based on, who each of these wonderful people are as a soul. So that's kind of the purpose of the program. It's also because I love to learn, and I find that, you can only it's sometimes it's a little exclusive, these conferences where it's expensive to go, but you want that experience of like maybe a couple of days in a row, in this case a couple of weeks in a row. You get to take in a variety of different talks and topics and different personalities, and so I try to create that online a little bit. The speaker series has been going all the way dating back to like 2010, so it's evolved over time and sort of become more known. People kind of know about it a little bit now, which is exciting. It also helps me get new people and interesting new topics and ideas and stuff like that. So all of these programs are run by donation. So anyone can come. There's a login link. It's just slapped up on the internet. You can just join. But when you get here, I trap you into donating. So I say, no, I'm kidding. But we collect donations. We collect donations during each of these events. I do not personally take any of the proceedings from these events. All that we collect goes straight to our speakers. And for me as a student of yoga, this is a way of doing a little seva in the astrological community, a little service to decrease the spirit of competition and envy that sometimes grows up at least in myself, and I know in others, to say, this is not just about me. To my students, I want them to know that there's a world of great astrologers out there and great topics. And I also want to try to make astrological education more accessible for others, and kind of help build community. So in that spirit, we collect donations. The suggested donation is $15 to $25 for each of the talks. I'm going to show you how to donate in just a minute. If you're on the Nightlight Astrology website, I'll put it in the chat box right now. You can navigate to that link in just a moment. So for tonight's talk, you can make a donation there, and everything will go to supporting Jason and his good work. But I also want to tell you about the other speakers coming up. This Saturday, kind of back to back this week, we also have a talk with Theodore Naker on the heart of Vedic astrology. And so he's going to be giving a talk which is really sort of tailored for people who have studied Western astrology, don't know much about Indian astrology, and would like to know more. And he's going to give kind of an overview about, what makes Vedic astrology unique and different, but also similar to Western astrology. That's this Saturday at noon Eastern time. The live login link is on the speaker's page and the events page, which I'm also going to put into the chat box right now. So you can check that out. And then at the very bottom beneath the bio, you'll see the login link. You've probably found that one for Jason's tonight as well. There's one more talk coming on Wednesday, April 17th, in a couple of weeks from tonight, with astrologer Adam Sommer, and he'll be giving a talk on the wisdom of Mercury cycles. He's actually in New York City right now doing a talk on the synodic cycles of Mercury, and he's someone that I actually first met apparently the last time he was in New York. He was speaking with my group when I was in New York City, and it was like, almost 10 years ago now. So kind of cool that it's coming full circle and that he'll be back giving a talk on Mercury on the 17th. That's at 7 p.m. Eastern, just like this one. And you can also find the live login link on the page. If you cannot make any of these talks, you may also donate for any or all 3 of the talks. And if you do so prior to the event, you can get a copy of the recording. Now, after the event, the recordings are not for sale. The rights go over to the speakers, and they may decide to make them for sale or not. It's up to them. So invite your friends, tell people about it. It's a great way to learn astrology. And you can check the website page. Every season, I'll post the new set of speakers. So you'll come back around closer to summertime and you'll see a new list of speakers. This summer, for example, I already know for sure that Becca Tarnas will be with us giving a talk on astrology, the astrology of Carl Jung in the Red Book, which should be very interesting. And tentatively, Demetra is supposed to come back and talk about the moon. And there's a few others that are in the wings for the summer and fall series as well. So lots of good things to come. All right, now let me show you how to donate for tonight's talk before I introduce Jason. So here's the payments and donations tab, which I will now put into the chat box. Suggested is $15 to $25. If you have more and you can afford to give more, we ask that you do, because sometimes people will come out and not have anything to give or not be in a position where they can donate. And that's just fine. If that's you, you're welcome to be here tonight. You don't have to donate to be here, but we ask that if you're able to, you do. So if you have more, you can help cover for people who don't have enough to donate, which is always very helpful and very much appreciated. If you have a little, you can I can donate $5, but that's all that I've got. That's plenty, and that's awesome. So whatever you have, please click the donate button and give. And throughout the night, I will also sort of ring the bell in the chat box and say, hey, remember to donate, and I'll put the link back in. And again, remember, everything that we collect goes straight to our speakers to support their work. And I always tell people, if you're a student of astrology and you're trying to make a practice for yourself, remember that in a way, astrology is a study of karma. And at least in the yogic tradition that I study, to build good karma, it's kind of cheesy and simple, but you do good deeds. So if you want to, thrive in the world of astrology, it's not a bad idea to support astrologers that are giving something to you that you may use in the future. So that being said, thank you all for being here tonight. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. So tonight's talk, Ceres and the Journey to Creative Embodiment, Grief, Trauma, Loss, and Mystery, is something that I'm really looking forward to. What I asked Jason to do when thinking about what topic to speak on was to speak on something that would he would feel passionate about and invested in, because I find that that's usually the best kind of talk to hear. So Jason got back to me and said this is what he wanted to talk about. I'm going to let him say more about it, but let me tell you a little bit about Jason. He's an astrologer and psychotherapist based in Santa Fe. He's taught widely on astrology, psychotherapy, and myth, including at UAC, NORWAC, the School of Evolutionary Astrology, Astrology University, Kepler, and in graduate level psychotherapy education. I'm very glad to hear, by the way, that they are inviting astrologers to speak on things like that. It's really neat. Yeah. His work has appeared in Mountain Astrologer and online. Jason mentors therapists integrating astrological insight into archetypal and relationally oriented psychotherapy, and teaches experiential astrology classes using psychodrama, astrodrama, and storytelling. I can tell you that the thing that captured me about Jason and made me want to invite him to this series was seeing him speak through Astrology University about Mercury. It was you're such a very compelling storyteller, and my relationship with Mercury, not my mental understanding, but the feeling of having a relationship through the way that you spoke and told a story really stuck with me. So that's what made me wanted to have Jason out tonight. Yes. He's also a consultant and educator in the psychotherapy community in the areas of character structure, trauma and dissociation, sexuality, and addictions. Jason is passionate about the potential of astrology to complexly imagine the human psyche and to creatively dream and redream ourselves and our relationships. So that being said, thanks so much for being here tonight, Jason. We're really excited to hear what you have to say about Ceres tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Adam, and thanks for creating this kind of a forum. I'm excited to share this and share it with people who I don't know and maybe don't know me. I really appreciate that you do this for the astrology world. I really do. So thanks for inviting me. I think I should share my screen. So I'm going to do that.
And if you'd like to say anything to people about how you'll take questions or when you'll take questions, feel free to do that.
Okay.
I'm here and can moderate for you if need be, but I'm going to put myself on mute now.
Okay. I think if you would like to ask a question as I'm moving through the presentation, you could put it in the chat box. And I guess I will probably be able to respond to it along the way. And if not, definitely bring it back to our attention at the end, because there'll definitely be space for questions at the end. Adam and I were talking about before we started that it feels good to have a little extra time to sink into particularly a couple of the case studies that I have for my practice relative to this topic. So I'm just sharing the screen. So it looks like it's there. So let's start. So I called this, I added a couple of words when I gave Adam a title for this material. I have shared this as kind of a work in progress somewhat before, but there's a fair bit of shifts and evolution in it. And so the title I've given it now is Ceres and the Journey of Embodiment, because that's really where I've kind of landed with Ceres, as to landed might be the right word, or embodied with Ceres, and really connecting to the themes of her story that involve grief and loss and trauma, and also mystery. And I think that's one of the ones that is the most sort of exciting and sort of transcendent. I think I'll say a little bit about the approach that I'm bringing to astrology and also to this kind of storytelling with mythology, because it's a little bit different. But I'm kind of moved to just jump into one of the slides, though, so I think I'll do that first. So this image is from the a pamphlet that was published by the discoverer of Ceres. So Ceres was discovered in 1801, and this was published in 1802. And what you are seeing is, sorry, I'm just pulling up the chat box because it went away. Okay, there it is. So the image on the left is from the discovery, like what was published, a sort of pamphlet that was published when Ceres was discovered. This was in 1802. And it's a pretty wonderful image that really reminds us of even just a couple hundred years ago, how people were looking at the sky a little bit differently than we do now in the modern age, with all of the light flooding the sky and all of the emphasis on daytime consciousness and sort of the forgetting of the night. And so you can see here, this is, just a puto, sort of a cherubic figure who's witnessing the sky. And that's an image of Ceres. So it's like looking up and seeing the goddess. And what you'll notice here is that Ceres is in a chariot, and it's drawn by two snakes. And you'll also see that she's carrying a torch and also a sheaf of wheat. And this is often how she's shown, and we'll get into some of the symbols from her that way. But what I wanted to bring in was a chart of a young woman that I did a consultation with maybe about a year ago, who came in with this chart. And as you can see, it's a pretty, I would consider Ceres here to be quite prominent in this chart. It's conjunct the North Node. It's very near to the zenith and widely conjunct the midheaven. I would call that a pretty prominent Ceres. And she shared with me a story about her birth that is pretty remarkable in relation to this. And what she shared with me is that when her mother became pregnant with her, she was considering having an abortion and was very much on her mind and very much planning. And the night before she was to go to have the procedure, she had a dream. And in the dream, two snakes came and insisted that she should have this child. And so then, months later, she did. And this child had the North Node conjunct Ceres, which to me just really speaks to the, sort of like, Ceres is meant to come into the earth in this person. I mean, there's just something like that. I know, isn't that amazing? Somebody said, wow, thanks for the, exclamations. They are helpful to me. I'm a little bit of a person who feeds on interaction with lots of, Libra qualities. So this was one of my favorite sort of stories that has been shared with me about Ceres, and quite a few of them have been shared on those lines, but that's probably the most sort of the dreamiest in that sense. So just to say about some of the way that I'm working with this story, when I approach astrology as a therapist, which is, in many ways my sort of primary identity is as a healer or a psychotherapist long-term, I do mostly long-term talk therapy, some embodied work, some psychodrama and astrodrama and this kind of thing with groups. And why I love astrology, Adam mentioned in introducing me, is because it allows me to more complexly imagine the human psyche. That's really my desire. I want astrology not to simplify things, but to complexify things, to give us a lot of different angles on someone's life and give us a lot of different ways in. Astrodrama, somebody asked, is basically the process of people embodying different planets in a chart. So if someone had, like in this chart, we might ask someone to play the North Node and another person to play Ceres, and then the director of the psychodrama or astrodrama would actually engage each person, encourage them to interact, see what they feel in their bodies being next to each other. How does it feel to be connected with each other? It's an incredibly experiential way. It is the way that I continuously learn about astrology, because it's a way of feeling into the story and feeling into the chart. It's interesting, just to give you the idea of it, it's like people who know a lot of astrology are often the worst at astrodrama, because they will have a sort of idea of this is what Mercury would do in this situation, or this is what Ceres would do, and have a little trouble relaxing into the spontaneity of it. But when you can relax into the knowing field that is constellated by the group in the chart, you do get a more direct transmission of the archetype, which often appears at first to be divergent from what we think we know. But usually as the story goes on, it will wrap around and you'll find out you were inside the archetype all along, just in a different part of the hologram. And the hologram is how I would want to describe my work with myth. So astrology, when it works with myth, usually, and not always, works with myth by sort of taking a set of myths and distilling them into a set of keywords or key concepts about a planet, right? So you take somebody like Venus, a bunch of stories about Venus which seem to point to, for instance, beauty, glamour, deception, revenge, affairs, infidelity, passion, all of this sort of thing. And you kind of get a keyword list like that. And I think many of us learned astrology this way and learned to work with myth this way. And it's a great daytime approach to myth. It's a way of taking the night dream that myth is, because myth is sort of a collective dream, and translating it into terms that we can use in the daytime and sort of rationalizing from the mythology. But in a nighttime approach to myth, what we actually do is step into the dream further. We step into the myth further, and we look at the complex dynamics of the myth and let the story itself sort of, we consider that when the planet is in the chart, it contains the entire hologram of the story of the stories that are part of that. So the idea here tonight, as we explore some of the chief stories that were told about Demeter or Ceres, is that we're really getting a sort of the hologram that can constellate. Any part of the story might constellate when Ceres is transited or aspected in the chart. It's as if you're really elaborating the whole thing. And what I'm wanting to look at is go into the more complex plot dynamics of the story, some of the details of the story, work with it like you would a dream in therapy, where you don't usually take a dream and just say, this is about that. Or actually, when you do, it always feels a bit tragic to me, because you've really missed some of the really rich potentials of the dream. And the other thing we know about dreams is that this day, I might think my dream is one thing, and 20 years later, I'll look back at that same dream and see it in a whole other way. So mythology can be entered in the same creative way. For me, it's a bit improvisation of the moment that I get to the bunch. It's relatively reductive for what I do. I'm more wanting to find creative ways to help people narrate their life experience. So that's kind of how we're working with myth, just as a kind of opening to do that. And I just want to make sure I said everything I wanted to say here. Yeah, okay. So I think we'll just go right into the myth now. And what I'm going to do is just sort of tell you two stories tonight, really. One of them is the story that was told in Eleusis, which is the more commonly known. It's narrated in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which I encourage you to look up on the internet. It's just a few pages long, and it gives you the story. And the other one is a much less well-known version that was told in Arcadia, which was kind of a more rural, wilder part of Greece. And we only know this story because of the records of a Roman ethnographer, Pausanias, who actually traveled through Greece and collected these stories. So here we go. First, from Eleusis. And what I'm going to do is tell the story and then really try to amplify it and sort of open it up psychologically, and look at also a couple of different people who I have worked with who really have strong experiences of this mythology and this astrology. So this is an image of Demeter, and I think I'll just read this just to kind of as an invocation. This is from the Homeric hymn. I began to sing of Demeter, the holy goddess with the beautiful hair, and her daughter too, the one with the delicate ankles, whom Hades seized. She was given away by Zeus, the loud thunderer, the one who sees far and wide. Demeter did not take part in this, she of the golden double axe, she who glories in the harvest. So when we're looking at Ceres, there's so many places we could go, you know, and this is how it is with all the gods. All the archetypes are very polyvalent, meaning they have lots of possible ways they can show up. And a lot of times when you look in astrology, you'll hear Ceres talked about as this kind of a nurturer, as the goddess of the grain, as the personification of the earth, as a great mother figure. You can get a lot of these interesting takes, for instance, from Demetra's book, Asteroid Goddesses. That's certainly the first reference point for most of us with these. But today, what I want to look at is Demeter as an archetype of grief and loss, and look at particularly the grief and loss that are involved for all of us, the loss of our innocence that's almost required to live on this planet, right? Actually, I think it is required if you're going to live here. And so we're going to look at it in that way. And as many of you know, the primary myth that's told about Demeter or Ceres is the abduction of her daughter Persephone. And the experience of the loss of her daughter. Usually when people work with this myth, there's kind of a focus on Persephone and her process. Like, she's abducted to the underworld, she's taken there. People are very focused recently on her initiation. There's a lot of pro-feminist scholarship that looks at how she becomes an empowered being and sort of enables a resistance to patriarchal norms. And all of it is really good. It's all worth looking into. But tonight, what I want to focus on is actually Ceres herself and her experience of the story and her experience of loss and of wandering. There's this notion of wandering that we're going to be really talking about as we go through the story. So here we go. And one of the things that I realized a lot of times, I'm like, okay, now we're really there. Now we're really there. Now we're really there. And actually, one of my very favorite books of myth is Roberto Colasso, The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony. I highly recommend. Amazing, amazing text where he is talking about the myths and also talking about their explication and also their writing, and kind of weaves his own tapestry of these stories. But one of the best things about that book is that at the beginning, it keeps on, he'll give a little snatch of a story, and then he'll say, but where did it all begin? And then he'll start another story. And as he finishes that one, he'll say, but where did it all begin? And this is the beauty of myth. It's the beauty of each of our charts, right? I mean, as soon as you go into the chart and you begin to elaborate a part of the dream, you can actually say, but where did that come from, right? And you keep following this thread all through this labyrinth of the psyche. And it's a really never-ending thing. The last thing I would want to use astrology for is to sort of put a full stop and say, this is how it is. We're just keeping that. The title, someone asked, is Roberto Colasso is the author, C-A-L-A-S-S-O, and the name of it is The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony. Somebody asked about me, so why not? I have a sun in Libra, moon in Scorpio, and Cancer rising. So you'll see I'm constantly, putting something in my mouth as a Cancer. Take that any way you want it, since I'm also Scorpio. So to the story. So in this story, this begins in this in this amazing field, and this is Persephone, who you see pictured here, and this is, I think, Peter Paul Rubens' image. I'm sorry I don't have the credits here, but if you ask me for the slides, they are credited in another version I've got. But this is Persephone, and begins in these amazing, beautiful paradise world. Everything is kind of just wonderful here, and Persephone is hanging out with all the maidens. They're all dancing and singing and having a good time. And this place, just to give you the feel of it, was the way it was described was that it was so fragrant with the scent of flowers that if a dog were pursuing its quarry, the dog would, if it wandered through this field, it would just become completely drunk with the smells and totally lose its interest in hunt. It was that level of just Edenic beauty and perfection. And this is the setting where the story begins. So it's this incredible space of what we might call innocence and joy and play and youth. And the story starts when Persephone is doing as she's doing there. She's actually bending over and about to pluck a narcissus flower. And those are narcissus on the left or on the right there. And just as she is about to pluck the flower, she does not actually pluck the flower. Just as she's about to, this happens. This is a depiction of the earth opening up, and suddenly Pluto, or Hades, comes up, grabs Persephone, and takes her down into the underworld, which is his domain. This is very sudden. It's sort of a breaking in or a rupturing of hell into this space, and this space of beauty and innocence and so on. And it is taken down. Now, I think I like this image because I think you can feel how powerful this is. I mean, you really have to give yourself permission to sort of imagine this utterly beautiful paradise, and all of a sudden there's a massive rupture, and up it all comes. This image is quite intense, to our modern eye, with all the movies and all that show, the buildings being blown up and all this kind of thing. This is maybe a little harder to sink into, but if you just take a moment, and this is how we work with charts and art, right? Because charts are art, is to let yourself have a kind of diffuse gaze at the painting and just kind of feel how intense the whole thing is. And this is a total, overwhelm. As this happens, you can see on the left, you can see Ceres there, or Demeter, actually over here at the chariot, you know, there and totally helpless to do anything about it. Now, this is interesting because actually in the myth, she's not present when this happens. But that's why I love art, right? Because the image, what we're encouraged to think about is the image, the situation, and how did it move this particular artist. And I think you can feel perhaps in your body the intensity of this moment. I can't speak enough of that. It is an abduction, and it is Persephone is taken to the underworld, and she is raped, and she is kept in the underworld at this point. This is another image from a Roman fresco that's quite powerful. There again, you can see Pluto. You can see Persephone being taken away, and you can also see Ceres again, you know, already in her state of profound grieving and overwhelm and nothing to be done. So when this happens, and one of the things that's the backdrop to this, sometimes told, is that before this abduction happened, there were many suitors coming for the hand of Persephone, and Ceres continuously denied this. She would continuously stop this from happening and would not allow Persephone to wed any of these other suitors, any of these other gods or demigods that would come. She wouldn't allow that to happen. And so this is a yeah, I don't know what those noises are.
Perfect.
And now someone's talking. So I don't know, Adam, if you have any powers. I don't know how to do that. Somebody's asked me to mute. Let me try. Although I don't think I know how. Yeah, noises are crazy distracting. I hear you. Adam, are you present? Because I have no idea how to mute other people. I'm not even sure I have the...
I think I got it.
Okay, great, thank you. So Ceres, yeah, and what was happening. So she was denying all these suitors from taking the hand of Persephone. And so sometimes the story is understood as sort of Pluto, and you can feel the Plutonian nature of this event, of course, I'm sure. But you can also hear it then, if you listen to that part of the story, you can hear how, you know, if you avoid and avoid and avoid, Pluto tends to get you, right? I mean, Pluto tends to, if you don't go to the underworld comes to you. You know, that is one of the themes of this story for sure. And one of the things I'll just say about this mythology is that it builds on mythology, and it is a syncretism of earlier myths from Mesopotamia, which involved the travel to the underworld by a goddess known as Inanna, who is a Venus figure. And she goes actually voluntarily to the underworld. In the Mesopotamian myth, Inanna goes voluntarily to the underworld and conducts some things. But by the time we get to Greece and the Greek imagination, people can't imagine that you'd want to go there voluntarily. So now we have to have it staged as an abduction in order to go down there, right? And that's actually the only way that the Greeks can imagine anyone would choose to go down there. But if we go earlier in consciousness, people understood underworld journeys as a basic element of the living process, so that the living must also go and face death, go and face these initiations. So Ceres, now having had her daughter abducted, is completely overwhelmed and in a state of shock. And she begins her wanderings. And she begins to cover the earth, go all over the earth. She doesn't eat, she doesn't bathe. She is going around and around for 9 days and nights seeking for her daughter. She has no idea where she is. She has no idea what has happened. But she immediately sets off. And you know, this is, you know, it's like she's lost this innocent younger part of herself, might be a way we might say that, right? That if we relate this to Ceres and her own intrapsychic process, if we think of the myth as the dream of Ceres, so that's what I would say to you. We imagine that Ceres comes into my office and shares this dream about the abduction of her daughter. One way we might speak to her about it is this abduction of a younger part of herself. She has lost a part of herself and does not know where it is. People come into my office all the time carrying a torch and saying, help me find my inner child, right? They don't say that. Well, actually, occasionally they do. But generally, they don't say it that way. But they come in sort of saying, I've lost my innocence. I did say 9 days and 9 nights, yes. And so she is covering the world. She's not eating. She's not bathing. She's not doing anything. All she's doing is looking for her daughter and having no idea how to find her. She's in a wandering kind of delirium, at this point in the story. Then she encounters this being, and this is Hecate. Hecate is a lunar goddess, often associated with the balsamic or the dark moon phase of the moon. And she finds Hecate, or Hecate finds her, depending who you hear. And Hecate actually begins to help her. This is a Greek goddess of magic. Sure, yeah, that's the neo-pagan way of looking at her. Magic might not be the way the Greeks would have looked at her, but yes, that is the person I'm talking about. And she is a figure. She's a crone figure, right? That's why she's often associated. She's often seen as part of the triple goddess that involved Artemis as the maiden, also a lunar goddess, and Selene as the matron, and Hecate as the crone. She is also looked at as the triple goddess with Persephone as the younger one, Demeter as the matron, and Hecate as the crone. So either way, she's embodying this crone figure, who actually, the crone is understood to encompass all three when we're talking about the triple goddess. And you can see here, she's got all three faces, if you notice here in this beautiful modern rendering of Hecate. So Hecate is there, and what has happened is that Hecate has heard what happened. She doesn't know, she didn't see, but she heard it. And she says to Demeter, I heard your daughter screaming. Let's go figure this out together. Right? So she actually begins to help. Hecate is very interesting. I'll just say a couple of things about her. She is definitely often associated with the underworld, and like Hermes, she can actually go to the underworld at will, up and down. Most gods and humans and everybody else can't just decide to do that. But Hecate actually was able to do that. Also, like Hermes, she was a goddess who was found at the crossroads. So when you wanted to worship Hecate, you actually went to a place where there were three crossroads. So this is actually the trivia, right? Which was the word trivia also comes from this. The trivia meaning three roads where they intersect. There you find Hecate, and there you leave offerings for Hecate. So she's a goddess where it all comes together, right? She's a goddess at crossroads of life. Hecate comes to your aid when you are at a crossroads, and that's when she will arrive to be of help. And Hecate makes use of everything. One of the most powerful stories I think about her is actually when you made an offering, you could offer garbage to her. You could actually give her... you could actually leave garbage, and it was said that she would eat garbage and make sense of it. So she knows how to work with decomposing. She knows how to work with death. She knows how to work with the underworld. She's kind of an ideal guide. And so they go off on a search. And what Hecate says is, let's ask the sun. So this god, Helios, who is said to drive the chariot of the sun, or to be the sun himself, he sees everything. Interestingly, he doesn't experience it, right? He's far away. But he does see everything. And so Hecate and Demeter ask him what has happened, and he tells them the story. He tells them what happened to Persephone. And it's at this point that Demeter is opened into the well of her grief. Imagine, right? You've just been told your daughter was abducted. That's what happened. And she's been taken to the underworld. This would be a pretty devastating answer to your quest of where is she. So Demeter is now kind of in this state of profound grieving. This image, as Lynette Tigner has done this image of her in her grieving. And you can feel, I think, this despair that Demeter is in. She has lost her beautiful and innocent child, right? And so the question starts to be, what will she do? How can she respond to this? And this is the point where Demeter does something that is truly remarkable in Greek mythology. She decides to go down into the earth and to take a mortal form. This does happen sometimes when the gods want something. So Zeus was famous for doing this, going down and taking the form of a human and then pursuing someone sexually. That was usually what he was up to. Or Athena will go down and take a form in order to offer mentorship and encouragement, say, to Telemachus or Odysseus in their journeys. But no one just goes down there to live a mortal life. That is not generally how that works. But that's actually what Demeter does. And we don't really get from Homer or others any particular insight as to why she did that. But I have some things to offer about that particular choice. But it's a very, very striking choice. This is one of those moments when we're working with myth, and what I would encourage is, it's just like with a dream. When impossible things happen in dreams, like things that can't happen in the daylight world. I shouldn't say they're impossible, but they just happen in night dreaming. They don't happen in this world. Then we really want to take note, because there's something really special and important about that. So what Demeter does is she goes down to Eleusis, the city of Eleusis, and she presents herself to the queen of Eleusis, Metanira. And she says, she makes up a really curious story, which is that she was a slave, and that she has been lost and wandering, and now she wants to come to the kingdom of Eleusis, and presents herself as a nursemaid who can take care of the prince. And she offers to be this nursemaid, and Metanira agrees to allow her to be the nursemaid to her child, whose name is Demophon. And so Demophon is a young boy, and Ceres becomes very attached to him, excuse me. And so she is taking care of him, and she suddenly begins to get the idea of what she wants to do with Demophon. And what she decides is that she's actually going to make him an immortal. And so her approach is this. Now, this is not an image of her. This is actually an image of Themis with her son Achilles. Everybody tries to make their people immortal, and the way they usually do it is by placing them in a fire. And so that's what Ceres does. And actually, I think I do have a modern image of her doing this. Yes. So there she is, placing the child in the fire. And the idea is that she'll place him in the fire and burn off his mortality, and all that will be left is this immortal. So she's actually going to turn this child into an immortal. She does this every night. So during the day, she looks like she's just taking care of the baby. And at night, she places him in the flames and is working on him as a project. But this doesn't go on for very long, because Metanira walks in one night and sees that this maid, who she has no idea is Demeter, has placed the baby in the fire. And she reasonably is pretty freaked out to see her nursemaid doing this with the child. And so she interrupts, and she stops this from happening. And there are many stories about what happens then. Some say that Demophon lived. Others say that he did not live as a result of this. But at this moment, Ceres is completely enraged that she's been stopped from doing this. She says something to the effect of, you humans think you know what is right and what is wrong, what's good and what's bad. You have completely messed this up. This was going to be an amazing honor for you. And now I'm done. And at this moment, Ceres goes and says to them, I want you to build me she reveals herself, right? She does an epiphany, right? She completely opens herself and reveals that she's actually Demeter. They, of course, are, completely shocked and really honestly quite lucky to have survived it, because most of these kind of epiphanous or apotheosis type appearances actually usually people don't make it. But she appears to them that way, and she says, I want you to build me a temple now. And they jump right on it. They build this temple. This is an image of the temple of Eleusis, a sort of reconstruction by an artist. The ruins of which remain in Eleusis, and you can visit, because that's where this myth was enacted by the Greeks for several centuries. Demeter locks herself inside the temple. She receives no one. She starves herself, and she also starves the earth. She casts the whole earth into winter, and it's the first time there's ever been a winter. There are not seasons prior to this in Greek mythology, and suddenly there is winter. There are seasons, but there's not a winter season. And so the whole earth goes barren in the wake of her grief. She is completely, done with this. And it becomes a problem, as you could imagine. She is basically induced famine. This is actually an image of Demeter in a different situation with Erichthonion, who is said to have chopped down trees in her sacred grove And so she curses him with hunger, but also with the inability to become full. Sort of like the hungry ghost in Buddhist tradition, right? Where you've got this tiny mouth that can't take much in, but a huge stomach that wants a lot of food. And so she does a similar thing with the Erechthonian, which is actually quite interesting. A couple of little side notes about Ceres. She appears extremely prominently in the charts of environmentalists and environmental activists quite a bit. I have found this myself, and I work with a lot of people who do, social justice and this kind of thing in my practice, but also at a larger level, you'll find a very prominent Ceres, frequently in the Libra in particular, but and there's a connection being made here, right? He's chopping down the trees, he's destroying the earth, and then he is starving and has to keep eating and never feeling full. And if you think about that right now in our world, where there's this obesity epidemic that's going on and people keep eating and aren't full, and there's an ecological crisis underway at the same time, right? And these are all held together in the hologram of Ceres. This is a place to look for understanding the ecological crisis, and you'll often find, I have found repeatedly, the involvement, of course, of Ceres in in eating disorders and so on. The other place we'll often find, just FYI, is the Virgo energy, because of course one of the images of Virgo is Persephone or Demeter, depending which Greek wrote what time. There are a lot of different goddesses involved in Virgo, but one of them is Ceres, Persephone. And so there is an issue here with food and with famine. But what happens as Demeter has starved the world is that the gods start, not liking it. And the reason that the gods do not like it is because she is preventing them from getting sacrifices, right? There's no food left, so the gods aren't getting sacrificed to. The gods basically don't take an interest in humans very much unless their own needs are not being met. And we might think about this in terms of planets and in terms of archetypes in astrology. Like I've always preferred to the word planet, I do prefer the Sanskrit approach, which is to say graha, right? Which is to grasp. The planets sort of grasp us when they have an agenda. They bring their imperatives and their injunctions. They grab us and take us places. And this is commonly the situation. And so the gods get really interested because they're not getting their due sacrifices as they should. And I think that, yeah, I totally agree that that's a powerful image of modern capitalism, Catherine. Yeah, I'm right there with you. The piece about not being satisfied but constantly consuming. And so that's the situation on Earth, is that there's famine. The gods are not being fed, so they decide they must intervene. And they send Mercury. Mercury starts talking to Ceres through the walls of the temple. And Mercury, as you may know, has got a silver tongue and manages to at least coax Demeter out. And she then comes to Olympus to basically demand this. I love this image of her approach. This is Zeus and Hera, and there's Demeter with her torch, really just absolutely demanding justice now that she knows that Hades has taken her daughter. And there is a bargaining process that happens in which, basically Zeus says, yes, you can have your daughter back. And this image is quite powerful. This is Hermes, who, again, he's one of the ones who can go into the underworld. That's our Mercury. And as Adam said, I have a passion for Mercury and would invite you to think of Mercury as an incredibly powerful archetype in the chart, not just communication in your head, but actually the facilitator of movement, of psychic movement. Mercury comes along when stories get stuck. That's the nature of Mercury, and you can see how he does it right here, right? The story is stuck. We are in a freeze point where Ceres has locked herself in a temple and nothing else is allowed to happen. The world is dying. It's a stuck moment, and Mercury intervenes to keep the story going. And this is the case for Mercury interventions in the Odyssey and the Iliad, all over the place. That's the Mercury energy. So something I just put a plug in is consider that Mercury, even by transit or progression or arc, solar arc, whatever it might be, is going to loosen up whatever he touches, and he's going to get the story rolling again. Frozen things, stuck things get unstuck, frozen things get unfrozen when Mercury comes. So Mercury goes to the underworld, and he goes down and retrieves Persephone according to this agreement. However, there is something else that happens, and I'm sure a lot of you know. there's a trick that Pluto plays. Now, this is variously told. Sometimes it's just told as a negotiation. The trick that he plays is that he asks Persephone to, just take some pomegranate seeds, and she does eat them. And it's just like in the stories of the Fae or others, anytime you accept the hospitality of someone who's in another dimension or in the underworld, if you accept their hospitality, then you actually are bound there. And so, Pluto has done this, or Hades has done this in order to keep Persephone. And the negotiation that is eventually worked out is that Persephone will spend part of the year in the underworld. Sometimes it's said to be 1/3, sometimes it's said to be half, and the rest of the world in the upper world. So she'll be down with Pluto at times. She'll be up with Demeter at times. And this becomes the agreement that they all make with Persephone, between Pluto and Demeter. And so at this point in the story, Ceres is overjoyed to have received back her daughter. I think I would go back to that wonderful Rubens painting. Yeah, that's, this is a remarkable scene, and it's a scene that I see in my office very frequently, right? When people actually are successful in actually connecting or retrieving a younger part of self that has been sort of taken away or dissociated through traumatic experiences. So we're often seeing this, and I think of Mercury as a guide who helps that happen. And just to say, Mercury is the traditional ruler of astrology, so this is also astrology escorting Persephone back, right? In my work, a lot of times we go to the chart like it's a Mercury figure, but I also think of it as an elder in the room. And so what I mean by that is the chart is like, it's like when I'm with a client, it's me and them, but it's a lot of other beings, of course, and all that. And we're halfway under the earth in my office here. This is a little bit of a underworld I'm speaking to you from. But the chart sort of sits in the corner, kind of like the Red Book over here. That's the Red Book of Jung back behind me. So I'm curious about Becca's work. But it's a place where you go to get wise stories. So the chart sort of sits in the room with us, and when the client or I are vexed or trying to understand something, we go to the chart. And the chart, like an elder in a traditional culture, does not say, here's what you should do, or here's the answer, or here's how it works. The chart tells you a story. And then it's for you and the client to work with the story and see how it links to their situation, right? You go with the dilemma, and the chart says a parable, right? And that activates your imaginative function, and then you use that to actually help yourself. And in this case, you use that to help yourself out of the underworld, right? You help yourself return, and we could think of this also as Mercury's helping to return. So this is kind of the people sometimes ask, well, how do you actually use astrology in therapy? That's how I use it. It's really a place that we go to potentiate our capacity to imagine other outcomes, right? To dream or redream our situation. So onward, she has eaten the pomegranate. She's sticking around for a third or half of the year. She's going to be up above the other time. Demeter, being overjoyed, does a couple of things. She bequeaths 2 gifts to humanity. As kind of almost like an amends for this perpetual winter that she had brought. One of them is agriculture. So we have to understand that up to this point, there was an understanding that prior to this myth, it was all hunter-gatherer, and now she brings the gift of agriculture. And here what you see is actually a depiction of the mysteries of Eleusis, and this is a depiction of Demeter and Persephone, and this is Triptolemos. And Triptolemos was a sort of puer figure, a young boy figure, who she taught the secrets of agriculture, and then he flew all around the world in this chariot drawn by the snakes and taught humankind agriculture. So this is one of her great gifts to humanity. And the other gift, and I don't know if I put this image in here, let me just see. Oh, this is Triptolemos traveling around the world giving the gift of agriculture. And then, yes, and the other gift she gives is the gift of her mysteries. Now, this is pretty cool. Ceres was associated with these profound mysteries of initiation and of spiritual initiation. And I know, isn't it a gorgeous image? I love that thing. And so she bequeaths this gift And the Greeks, in fact, worked with Ceres in their own mystery rites. And this is, if you've heard of the Eleusinian mysteries, this is where they came from. And what we don't know entirely what happened with the Eleusinian mysteries, but we do know that any Greek that you have heard of that's famous, like in philosophy, like Plato, Socrates, and so on, they will have spoken of having been initiated in the mysteries. And what you did was you went to Eleusis, you entered the cave of Pluto, which you can still see the entrance to the cave of Pluto in Eleusis. You entered the cave of Pluto, and something happened in there that when you left it, you were not the same. Now, we have a little bit of a notion that what was happening inside the cave was that there was a reenactment of this myth that I've just shared with you. And there was some sort of way that this myth was seen as the key to living in a way that was both transcendent and immanent in its conception of divinity. So in other words, that you could live with a notion of life itself as alive with the divine, but also of a transcendent notion of the divine as sort of in some sense apart from. And somewhere to go to, and both have their advantages in spiritual practice, right? I'm sure most of you could imagine that. So these are, yeah, right, exactly. If you think of Kubler-Ross, and this is actually a great point that somebody has put on there, right? You've probably already been able to hear that there's some of those traditional stages of grief are in this myth, and we're going to explicate that a bit more. But exactly, transcendence and mystery is really often the greatest gift of grief, right? It's one of the greatest gifts is you somehow realize something that you can't realize another way without going through this. There's just not another way into it. Like, you know, Ceres, for me, one of the things that I would say about her is that she represents this profound kind of knowing. This is not Jupiterian knowing, where you jump up and ascend and you go to Mount Olympus and you look out over the world and now you know, which is a great knowing. This is knowing because you've fucking been through it. Pardon me, but that's how I am. So this is knowing where you have like been there. You know because you've gone through something. That's a very different kind of knowing. It's quite embodied, and we'll get more to that embodiment. So there's something in these mysteries about being able to embody, but also be connected to the transcendent. And that's why they're mysterious, right? So I think I might have one more image. Nope. Okay. So let's go to a kind of amplification psychologically with this. What might it be telling us about the psyche? How can it help us in understanding ourselves? I love these two images. That's Ceres or Demeter on the left, and that's Persephone on the right. And as I said to you, if I see this as a dream of Ceres, and we could actually go into any character and have it be their dream, and it would get very interesting. So this is just, you know, this is just one way in. This isn't definitive about what this myth means. I already, a couple of people have put in things that are already, the dreaming function is activated in the field between us, right? So people are already bringing additional ways to enter and talk about the dream. This is one that I have done. So we could talk about this as two dimensions of the psyche. We could talk about it, you know, as I said, Robert Graves and others talked about the triple goddess, but I'm just going to work with these two for the purposes of this. And for me in this story, what I hear is a story of a loss of innocence and the journey of the psyche to come to terms with this as a totally necessary psychic process. And that is what I would say that Ceres is about in the chart. When I look at Ceres, what I see is this is going to tell me about any given person's journey to coming to terms with the loss of innocence, which is utterly essential to the process of incarnation and living a life on earth. And even more so that the dreaming of the myth is connected to the healing process and the specific relational configurations that occur along the way. So again, we're going to look at the complexity of the myth, not just say, okay, it's embodiment and that's what it's about. That can get you started, but I want to look at some of the dimensions of it. So the dilemma looks something like this. Innocence is free and seems to be forever. So imagine yourself, we're back in the paradise world, right? Innocence seems like this free forever thing. The possibility of it ending is totally delayed, constantly delayed. And most of us want to delay the lack of our innocence. Most of us don't want to do that. One of the problems with places like the country where I am in the US is the desire to hold on to a notion of our innocence, right? A refusal to acknowledge the lack of innocence, a refusal to give up a kind of like, you know, greatness that we can somehow get back to, right? And so this innocence notion is very powerful in the psyche. We all have a longing to feel our innocence. And so we often put off the initiations that life brings to deal with the lack of that, as Ceres was said to have done. Some place in the psyche seeks to protect it, to keep it from its natural experience of life. And this is where I've said the risk of narcissism is imminent. It's so interesting, right, that she is about to pluck a narcissus flower. And that's just kind of great. She's about to pluck a narcissus flower. And what that says to me is if you hold on to your innocence, you become encapsulated in narcissistic process. So Ceres, one of the ways to think about Ceres is that wherever she lives in the chart and wherever she transits, she will defeat the narcissistic impulse, right? The narcissistic impulse involves sort of holding on to my innocence, holding on to my goodness, not wanting to acknowledge the shadow or the problem. And there's an encapsulation that happens there. And the Ceres energy will defeat that. But this shows us that the risk of that is imminent. It's almost happening in this story. She's almost taking it. And we're definitely all at risk. Someone asked about the relationship of Ceres and Chiron. I'm going to make a note of it and we can come back to that. And yes is my answer. There definitely is the connection. At the time of the perfect ripeness of youth, a powerful force arises which takes the innocent part away. And in the wake of this betrayal and loss, a psychic wandering begins, right? So there's this wandering that Demeter has come in. I'll just say before this story, there were said to be 3 seasons. Most of the time when we hear of Greek cosmology, we hear about 3 seasons and there was no winter. So this thing is the introduction of winter. I'm not going to spend too much time there. This just as a path through, I think I'm going to just move past this for now. But just to say, you can see that there's a moment where she is given some guidance. There's a moment where there's an enactment, and we'll say a little more about that. A reckoning, right, where she's bargaining, and then these gifts that come out of it. So this to me is the Eleusinian way of dealing with grief and loss. It's a different way than the other story that we're going to talk about, but it's a really important one. It has enormous possibilities. And again, what I would invite you to think about when you're thinking about this talk and going places with this in your imagination is looking at your series and wondering about which aspects of the hologram have been constellated. And I would be glad, by the way, I have a sort of a couple of pages on various astrological correlations. For instance, which parts of the story tend to be activated when which things are being which archetypes are in dialogue. So like someone said, Chiron conjunct Ceres. And frequently I will see that connected to the part of the story that involves healing. We'll come to what I'm talking about there. But there are a lot of different moments. It's also the mentorship piece to Triptolemos will often come when you see Chiron and Ceres together. But there are a lot of different ones, but I'm just kind of giving you this whole thing. Keep in mind, this might be important to say, part of what we're doing is considering that the story of any myth is not actually linear. It's just like a dream, as we understand dreaming life more recently. Dreams don't occur in straight stories and linear narratives. And you even know that from waking up, and you'll have had like something happens in the dream and all of a sudden you're somewhere else and doing something else. But the whole dream tends to be a series of images if we understand them. And then the daylight ego that wakes up and writes your dream into your dream journal, which I really hope you do. I mean, if you want to be a great astrologer, one of the best ways is to really love your dreams and just totally give yourself to your dreaming self. That's the night. Astrology is a night art. I love that Adams called this night light astrology. That's what we are about. So if you're recording your dream, though, what's really happening is you've had a series of images in your head. I don't know if this is what's really happening. Anyway, one thing that might be happening is that you've had a series of images in your head, and then in the morning, you kind of put together a story very quickly. I just got an indication that my battery's low. Just a sec. I don't know if it means my computer or my body. So let's see if that, I just want to make sure. Yeah, okay, it looks like I'm plugged in. So one of the things that happens with this, just 1 second, I do want to make sure that got plugged in. Yeah, okay. And I also lost the chat window. Let's see. Yeah, okay. So one of the things that you could think about with dreams is that, and with mythology, is that it is not especially linear. It's more like a lot of different images. We say, I had a dream. The Greeks said, I saw a dream. You see a set of images, right? And then in the morning you wake up and you put a linear narrative on them, and that helps you make sense of them in the daylight world. And so it's a very useful thing to do. But what this also looks like, if you want to work with dreams, you can work with them by also sort of splitting up the moments in the dream, not doing a linear narrative, but actually sort of doing it in space. Like Jung had a system of putting it all on, putting it on a piece of paper and then putting all the different components of the dream, the moments of the dream in space. So they stop having this linear time thing, right? Because the night doesn't have the same relationship with time as the day does, right? I mean, the beautiful thing about astrology is it bridges the two times, right? It bridges nighttime or kairos, it bridges with chronos, the daytime. So this experience, by the way, that's Mercury because he's twilight. He's bisexual. He doesn't have sect, right? Unless he has sect by condition, but he doesn't have sect inherently night or day. He's a twilight archetype, so he's bridging. So if we want to bridge it as astrologers, we can do this and we can bring that. So as we enter this piece, that's why I'm saying any part of the hologram might constellate with the archetype. So if we take this story, then we could say that a guide is located who can help make the journey. This is the beginning of her wandering, and this person does not know everything, but they do hear the symptoms and what they generally mean. Now, this for me is a very powerful description of a person who helps you through your trauma or through your grief, such as a therapist, but it doesn't have to be a therapist or an astrologer, because Hecate hears it. She's heard it, right? Like just the same way we hear it from the client. And so you get the feeling that Hecate already knows what happened, but she doesn't really know, right? Just like if a client comes in to me with trauma that they don't know about, but they can tell me some of the things they're going through or some of what's happened, I can sort of start to put together like what might have been there, but I can't hold it as if I know it because I do not know it. What I do instead is what Hecate did. I try to help the client move to the place in them that has seen it all. And that's Helios, right? That's the solar transcendent function. That you actually help someone achieve access to a wise place in the psyche, which has seen what has happened, but has not lived or embodied it, right? That's Helios in this thing. Then we can get to this next part where Demeter has actually, incarnated. If you'll remember, the next thing that happens is after she gets this information, she actually goes down and incarnates. She makes her immortality mortal. This is the thing that she wouldn't let Persephone do. She wouldn't let Persephone move down, right? Down from the middle world to the underworld. But she herself now moves down from the upper world to the middle world. And this is super crucial because when we're talking about this process with Ceres, it's not ascendant type spirituality, it's descendant, right? It's about descent. You're going to go down. One of the most powerful psychodramas that I ever had in a class of mine was when a person had an aspect between Ceres and Venus. I don't recall immediately what the aspect was, but Ceres was in Capricorn or Scorpio. And the person who played Ceres, I wish I had a hoodie, but the person who played Ceres happened to have a hood on, so she put the hood over herself. And at some point, Venus said, I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do. And Ceres, the person playing Ceres, looked right at her and said, I know, let me see if I can get this, like I'm going to get into the energy field of this, right? She said, I know the way, and the way is down, right? This is what Ceres does. Wherever Ceres transits, she's going to compel a downward journey. Right? An incarnative journey, not a transcendent journey, not transcendent in the way that we think about it. Now, there is a mystery here because we'll get to that. So she goes down, she takes the form of Doso, but at the same time, she's not fully committed to doing this. And one of the most powerful things I think that happens in the story is when she's working with Demophoon, right? And what she's doing with Demophoon is actually, you could call it what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross called bargaining, right? She's actually trying to create a new child who's immortal. I mean, it's hard to miss that this is actually a little bit of a substitution, you might say. And she's trying to substitute for what's going to make innocence live on forever. So she hasn't completely accepted this, right? She's in between, just like we all can be when we're starting to come to terms with something, but we're still in an internal negotiation. You know, negotiation is a big part of this story between the gods and between parts of Demeter herself. And what's really interesting to me also here is the role of Metanira. Metanira, the mother of Demophoon. I looked up Metanira, you know, what does that mean in Greek? Because I knew Nira was about dreams. Meta, one of the words for meta means to interrupt or to disrupt. So what is Metanira? She is the dream interrupter, right? She's taking this, she's interrupting Ceres' dream of recovering her innocence. She is, breaking it. And I can tell you as a therapist and an astrologer, frequently we are in the role of metanira, right? We frequently are required by the moment between ourselves and the chart and the client. We are frequently required to interrupt the dream that they may have. That is frequently something we have to take on ourselves. We play the role of metanira, and we're frequently shut out then, whether literally not so often, but often energetically, you'll feel the person go into the temple like Demeter did and say, I'm not participating in this. And back off. And that's what happens when the desire to substitute is thwarted. She falls into the anger, she falls into the isolation, the starvation, and the deprivation. But the thing about grief is the ecosystem of oneself cannot sustain it, right? In other words, the earth can't live this way. It's not going to work. And then what we will see is that a conversation will begin, again, with the help of a skillful mediator. This is Mercury. And the only deal that can be made is made, which is not to return innocence, right? Persephone doesn't get to come up and just become innocent all over again. It doesn't work that way. What actually happens is that she has to be in this endless dialectic of innocence and experience, and innocence and experience. So we do have the capacity to know our innocence again. And I think that many of us know that we have that. But we also must come to terms with our experience, right? And there's a dialectic. This is also said to be how the seasons came to be, because every season when Persephone was taken to the underworld, the world would be cast into winter with Demeter's grief, and every season when it would come back, the world would be, happy again. And so around and around she goes. And we can also see that with these two gifts, I think these are pretty interesting too, that the agriculture gift actually depends on seasonality, right? Agriculture actually requires cyclical process and seasons. And the mysteries also somehow become possible out of this. So this entire mythology, this entire process or parts of it are active when Ceres is prominent in the chart, or whatever, wherever Ceres is, and whatever kinds of aspects are going on, and especially by transit. So, I would like to share with you briefly a story, and I'm just looking at the time. Yeah, we can get into both of these cases. I'm going to go a little quickly through this one because I want to get there. But this is a story that is connected to the, there it is, to the Eleusinian path that I went through with somebody. So this is a person who came to me in her late 60s, early 70s, and I'll just say a little bit about her background, which I think you'll be able to feel in the chart already. She came, and one of the biggest things was she talked about she's married to this very narcissistic man, kind of a blowhard, know-it-all. I would call that Sagittarius. Okay, that thing is happening again where somebody unmuted. So it's kind of interesting because that feels like her husband can't shut up. And I don't mean that about whoever's unmuted. I just think it's funny. So anyhow, the Sagittarius on the descendant actually can be, right, a kind of a know-it-all person. I mean, that would be the shadow, I think, of that for your partner. It doesn't have to be that way. And she was involved with him and kind of keeping him going. You'll notice she has a retrograde Venus in Sagittarius, also conjunct that descendant. You'll also notice she has the 7th house ruler is Jupiter, and it is also located in Scorpio conjunct the Sun. That would tell us about potential for narcissistic partners. I don't know how to do that. Somebody asked, can we see the whole chart? And I think the way that we're doing the slides is going to make that impossible, but let me see. Maybe if I shrink, yeah, there you go. Okay. Let's see. So yeah, someone's mic is not muted. Could you change that? That would help us all. Thank you. This person that she was married to, she was very identified with the marriage and with what she thought that she should be in the marriage. And you can see a South Node in the 7th house, in my experience, often says there's old patterning and a tendency to default into the direction of becoming very partner-oriented, and that perhaps the balancing act that's going to be required with the node in the 1st is going to be to also find a place for one's own self-centeredness. The result of some of this, or the other thing that was playing out with this, you can see she has a Capricorn moon. She's got a kind of tough-minded approach to her life, stiff upper lip, gonna kind of just get through it, including with her marriage as an example of that, over and over again. One of the ways that I would look at this chart that I think is the key for us, though, just that's just to give you a little background. One of the things I'll also say, though, she felt very unchosen by her parents. Just to come back to that chart for a minute, that's certainly a Capricorn moon situation that I see very frequently. But also, you'll notice that Saturn is square her sun, and she particularly felt this with her father. And so I think that's pretty straightforward father complex that can happen there. Yeah, I would look at the dispositor of an asteroid, although I'll remind you that Ceres is a planet at this point. In my astrological imagining, she is a planet. But yes, I would definitely look at the dispositor for sure. So this T-square is where I think the focus of the work really was. If you look at Pluto, Saturn opposite Ceres in this chart, and you can also see that it's T-squared to the Sun, Jupiter. This to me reads about deferred grief. This to me reads about the deferred grief, sort of similar to our Demophon story. One of the things that you could consider is that in a T-square, one of the ways I look at it is that the pivot planet, or the planet that's receiving both the squares over here, or planets in this case, is somehow trying to deal with the conflict between the other two. Now you can see Pluto opposite Ceres tells you this is the pretty prominent Ceres, because that's the actual opposition in the mythology, right? And somehow this Sun Jupiter is trying to mediate it. And the way that this person tended to try to mediate this was actually to try to be kind of in this big expanded place all the time in her life. That's to me a very Sun Jupiter way to do it, and she's pretty intense about it with the Scorpio. So it's trying to always sort of be in this really large expanded place, and to be not really dealing with the grief. It felt very Demophon to me. Keep this thing alive. Keep on coming back to everything's shiny and bright. Everything's big and beautiful. All of that kind of thing. And there's this sort of deep desire. And yet at the same time, I would say to you that there's a pretty strong, evolutionary intention. I don't like that language because I don't really look at it that way, but a pretty strong imperative. With Pluto opposite Ceres, there's going to be a pretty strong imperative to deal with your grief, to deal with your loss, to deal with your situation. And so when she entered therapy, it was because she had been going through repeated experiences of cancer and remission, and her family felt like she needed to really face it. She was in a very compensated place, total Sun Jupiter, like everything's fab. I don't know why they're also worried, but also often coming back into a more depressive state, because Saturn over there squaring that Sun Jupiter is not going to let you get away with that all the time, right? And frankly, neither is Ceres. They're both going to be insisting, all three of those planets, Ceres, Jupiter, or Ceres, Saturn, and Pluto, are going to be insisting that the inflation of Jupiter Sun is not going to last for very long. So she entered therapy, though, in this relatively compensated place where that Jupiter Sun is really running strong. And her favorite thing to do that I think is really interesting is to be ballooning. She was a balloonist. We have a pretty active balloon world here. The Balloon Festival of the World happens in Albuquerque. And so she was a hot air balloonist. And it's an amazing ascending image, isn't it? I mean, you can't go much higher, than in a balloon. You float above everything. You don't have to deal with much. You're going up with Jupiter on Olympus. You're going up to the Helios with the sun, away, right? It's a beautiful, just right. She bought a Maserati. I mean, she did a lot of things that would be called hypermanic kind of, what I would call it is a flight into health. That's a beautiful psychoanalytic phrase. Don't hate on psychoanalysis, by the way, everybody. It's got some interesting stuff. So she did a flight into health, right? Like meaning, and you could even think of that as a creative way to talk about the sixth house placement here, but it's basically like all is well and everything's great. Then she has a dream. And this dream, I'll just say a few things happen all at once, right? She has Ceres square Ceres, and another surgery is going to be needed. So here's like another moment of loss, another moment where innocence is intruded upon, right? And this transiting Ceres is going to affect that whole T-square. And then she has Ceres retrogrades in her chart, a degree just before it gets to the sun. So just before it gets to the sun, it retrogrades, it goes back. And she has a very successful surgery. And this is when she goes on her spending spree and buys the Maserati, right? So it's again, in my mind, it's a bit of a delay of the grief. And she has this dream that happens just as Ceres goes direct. So Ceres went direct, and as Ceres goes direct, it makes a trine to the moon, and she has this dream. I'm coming back to my home, and there are police everywhere. All of the wallpaper in my house has been ripped away, and I can see a safe. So there's this ripped away wallpaper, and there's a safe that's been behind the wallpaper the whole time. The police don't know what has happened, but my balloon has been stolen. So she had a balloon. She had a whole truck for the balloon, and also a separate garage that was the balloon's house. Which this is a sacred balloon, right? And I'm laughing not at that, right? I think it's a kind of a remarkably resilient story too, right? Like, this is somebody who really says something is special here. The police don't know what has happened, but my balloon has been stolen, taken away, and unlikely to be found again. And she also says to me that in her actual house, there's no safe behind that wall in the kitchen where this was done. So this is a pretty interesting dream. Where do you think her focus was? You can bet her focus was on that balloon and who took my damn balloon and how do I get my balloon back? Where do you think my focus was? I'm getting real interested in that safe. Like, what is in that safe? There's this safe that doesn't exist in the daytime world. And yet what's back in there, right? And you kind of have to wonder, like, what is enclosed? What underworld does this represent? What riches might it contain? Just like the underworld did have riches in it, in that thing. This is an interesting dream that we did work with quite a bit because it occurred when there's this trine to the moon. And I'll just say, trines are often about awareness, that you become able to see and have awareness of things during trines. And so this was a powerful opening for us, and particularly to help me understand how this was sort of fitting together for her. And at this point, a couple of things happened. She started to again get these issues with health. Ceres then was, had now reached opposition to the sun. It was returned to the degree from where it had retrograded, right? It had retrograded in Taurus, and now it returned to the degree where it had retrograded, so the stationing degree. So it's kind of come out of its shadow, as people often call that. And then as Ceres squared the Saturn, and then the IC, and the MC, and the Pluto, and so on, as the progressed moon also opposed Ceres, she has this serious event, this interruption. And all of a sudden, there's no denying it. Her body really started to change in more fundamental ways, right? She had been managed to stave this off with treatment quite a bit, but now there's no denying it. She is changing. This was the Metanira moment. This is the moment where the dream is interrupted. You can't pretend anymore. You are faced utterly with this situation. And so at this point, this is when she goes into the temple, right? Metanira has entered the dream and interrupted the dream. And she actually starts to restrict her food intake. She starts just drinking. And this is voluntary. Nobody told her to do this. She just begins to close off. She begins to go into a deep depression, which is in some ways utterly necessary, right? Like, the journey of depression is so important for many of us to actually be, again, depression is a coming down. You can probably hear, by the way, how Ceres and Saturn have some similarities, but also differences in what seem to be their effects, right? Saturn often lays us low. Saturn's often connected to depression. There is a harshness to Saturn and a more doctrinaire and disciplinary quality to Saturn, whereas in Ceres, we're often confronted with very poignant loss, very different kind of experience of being brought low. It doesn't have quite the rough, of Shani, in the Vedic, you strip everything away. It has much more of a loss I can only really convey it somatically. I don't know that I have the right words, but I think you can probably feel the difference. But there's something similar too. At this point, she also at this point, I also shared with her about the myth of Demeter and Persephone, because we began to see in the chart what was happening with all these retrogrades and transits to her T-square, and share with her about it, and help her with meaning. See, that's another way to use that Jupiter, right? Jupiter likes to see meaning and significance, and particularly in Scorpio. And so the Jupiter sun begins to actually work with this in terms of meaning rather than in terms of spiritual bypass, or not spiritual bypass, just bypass, and begins to do that. It's interesting because at this time when we were doing this, by the way, somebody who has Ceres and Aquarius in the 9th, an astrological, mythological sense-making would be a very helpful thing for them, right? that actually is going to be a natural capacity to see the myth. She actually shared with me some really interesting things. One thing that she shared with me was that when she was in a sorority, their initiation was actually an enactment of the Persephone myth, right? So this had been coming through her life all along. This Ceres myth had been playing through. And that was the last time in her life when she felt like she was her own person, before she became kind of subsumed in this marriage with this narcissistic guy. So this is the way that the myth cycles through our lives, right? And she's now kind of picking up where she left off, because she did start to be in her own thing. And she actually said to me, when I shared with her the myth, she said, "I'm in a temple, aren't I? That's where I am right now." And I said, "Yeah, you are." And I began to interact with her, and actually at one point, one of the most poignant moments for us was when me saying to her about her own value and about this grieving part of her being okay to have. Because again, a lot of the pressure that she has felt is to be this happy, fun person. And for me to be able to say to her, and I remember very vividly in this room on this couch, right, taking her hand, and she's at this point, really doesn't know it, but is beginning to die. And I took her hand and spoke to her and just said, that I loved her and loved this part of her, and it was totally true. And this is sometimes considered quite a daring thing to do in therapy. For me, it feels like natural. In the right situation, of course, there are people we don't say that to because of what they might do with that. But this is definitely somebody who could metabolize that type of love. And at that time, that was this Mercury moment, right? Where Mercury says the right thing somehow. And that's not about me being Mercury. I don't like to archetypally identify. That's dangerous. But Mercury's speaking through me, right? And being able to say that. And then she begins her negotiation. And this is when things turned into a very transcendent last few months for her. One of the things that she did during this time was she actually, in some sense, turned her son over to me. She had a son who she felt like she had really not been there for, because she was trying to perform and be this important high society. She's a 1%er, if you thought about it economically, living a very superficial life at one level until this stuff came in. And then in these last few months of her life, she really began to understand herself in a deeper way. She kind of gave her son to me, which reminded me of Triptolemus. And he came in when Ceres was opposite her Mercury, and began to work with me as well. And to, in some sense, carry on her own lineage, and what had happened to her became something that he could work with consciously. And before she died, which she did, she was able to sort of move into what I would call these very profound mysteries that have to do with embodiment and connection. It was a really powerful thing, and that's exactly right. She did come to a peaceful place and did some amazing work that I think she had waited her whole life to do. There was a deferring that had happened for her whole life. We were opening the safe together, right? She's reimagining her story. And again, reimagining the chart, right? The chart shifts from Sun, Jupiter, and Scorpio being about avoidance and inflation and big balloons flying in the air, which is all totally great and beautiful, by the way. This is not about saying, oh, what a mistake she made for 50 years. I mean, who knows what the timing of the soul is? Anybody who thinks they know your destiny or your timing, any astrologer who gives you that crap is totally wrong. I don't mind saying it. I mean, there's just no way that anybody can claim that kind of knowledge. And if you do, I think you're abusing someone. I don't know what should have happened for her. I tend to think what did happen is what should have happened. But by the way, she was a beautiful balloonist. Her balloon was gorgeous, and she took people up in it all the time. This was where her generosity came out, as you might imagine, with the Jupiter. And otherwise, she was not an especially generous person most of her life. And this is where this then transmuted, though, into this meaning-making possibility. And this is all under these Ceres transits, which I think I've said in a bit of a hodgepodge way, but I think you can follow. So that's one way with grief. And I'm going to jump to the other story now. This is a little bit of a jarring jump because I feel like, but I think what I'd like to do whenever I tell this story, I think I just like to take just a moment of silence. My client did die, and her journey meant quite a bit to me. So if we could just take just a little moment. I do like to think that she you know, went up in the balloon and also went down into the underworld both. You know, that's the heaven and hell that we all get to experience, and we get to might be that way of saying that. Okay, so I'm a crier, by the way. It's called, I think it's called Cancer Rising. So we're going to go to the other story, the Arcadian story, which is super interesting and such a different approach and way of working with this wandering. The story begins at the very beginning, and thank you all for the comments you just made. They are meaningful to me. Yeah, it's really, this is what Ceres can do, right? Like she initiated, my client, of course, initiated me to ministry, right? I mean, I have walked with many dying people. It's one of the things that I do. But each person has their own gifts and approaches. And she, you know, I also felt like a sort of Triptolemus figure for her that she's sort of bequeathing to me, right? And then I'm teaching agriculture to her son, right? I'm teaching the mysteries to her son, you know, and this goes on. So let's go to the Arcadian myth. Just a moment, I just need to turn my thing. All right, this is a picture I took. This is in Arcadia and in Greece. It's a very not well-known space, and I went there with Demetra, George, and Brian Clark back in 2011. So, you know, almost exactly a Saturn square from now, actually. It was at the end of 11. And so she, that we were taken by people to this grove, which was said to be a sacred grove of Demeter. And I think it's a nice space where we've kind of had our little moment with my client. Arcadia is a whole different place than Eleusis. If we think about ancient Greece, Arcadia would have been more of a modern city to them, like a very sophisticated, high culture sort of space. Arcadia was much more, I've been a little scolded for this by someone, but I would say wilder. A lot of times in the contemporary imagination, so for instance, in the imagination of the people who did the Grand Tour, you know, in the 1800s to 1900s, when they would go to all the East and Greece and Turkey and so on, would say that Arcadia was very pastoral, and you know. But I think if we go back further, we'll find it's a more wilder place, and wild is where we're headed. We're headed to the wild and woolly Greece. It was said to be the home of Pan and the centaurs, so you can already feel how this is getting wilder. It was also said to be the original home of Hermes, who's a trickster among many things. It was, you know, very far, in their terms, it was very far from Athens and Eleusis, and kind of uncivilized in a way. The story starts the same way, right? It's Demeter is wandering, but instead of finding Hecate and Helios, she encounters Neptune. I kind of love this image. And actually it's Poseidon that she encounters. And I want to say something about that. This is super important. So Poseidon is the Greek name for Neptune. I mean, they are distinct, but essentially the same god. And, you know, one of the most difficult associations for people when it comes to myth and astrology is connecting our modern view of Neptune with the mythological view of Neptune Poseidon. Because in myth, Poseidon was a real jerk. He certainly wasn't, a gentle illusionist. He certainly wasn't about transcendence and, all the Neptune glamour and mirrors and dreams and so on. He was a really vicious and vengeful type of god. He was almost always upset. Now, though, I just want to name all this because I think he needs some reimagining for us, and we need to understand him a little more. Where I go to with Poseidon is that he was the ruler of the most undervalued part of the Greek world. You know, when Zeus and Poseidon and Hades, which is our Jupiter, Neptune, and Pluto, when those three divided up the world and said each of us will have a domain, because there were 6 Olympians, and by now patriarchy has totally influenced all the mythological thinking. So the 3 boys are going to rule the world, right? We're already into a very saturation with patriarchal process. So these 3 are going to do it. Zeus takes the the regular world and the land. Poseidon takes the sea, and Hades takes the underworld. But by far, the underworld and the land were considered the most valuable. The sea, much less so. So Poseidon has been undervalued. You see him undervalued throughout mythology. One of the biggest stories that I'll just tell briefly, and you can think about this with the Pallas Athena asteroid, was the naming of Athens. So in the story of how Athens came to be called Athens, there was a competition that was going to be held so that the people would decide what to name their city. And the competition was between Athena and Poseidon. And it would have been, they each offered a gift to the city, to the citizens. And on that basis, the citizens chose. Athena offered an olive tree. And the olive tree was seen as an incredibly useful gift, right? It provides shelter, it provides a way to cook, it provides food, provides clothing, provides, all of those different pieces of civilization. It was seen as a really useful gift. Poseidon's gift to the Athenians was a salt spring, meaning, saltwater spring coming up through the earth. And the Athenians were not interested in that. And so for that reason, rather than it being called Poseidonopolis, they called it Athens. And this is a really important story about the evolution of consciousness at that time in the world. So this is archaic to classical Greece. It's this zone that's maybe between 800 and 400 BC, right? And so this is a moment where we're beginning to see the night consciousness and the part of us that values the deep unconscious, because what is salt water? What is the sea but the deep unconscious? That part has become devalued. We don't have any interest in that. That's not important. We want to build cities, create civilizations, create rationality. And this is a crucial moment of the movement of night into day, like the dominance of night yielding to the dominance of day. This is something that I have a lot of passion about, is thinking in terms of night and day. And I'm kind of a little bit of a night, more on the night side, because the night gets devalued during day, right? And day really achieves its conquest right around 200 BC to 200 AD, which, by the way, happens to be the Hellenistic era for astrology. So it's sort of interesting that we're all looking back there, including me. But we have to remember that what was happening then was actually day was actually conquering night. You suddenly have all these vocabularies of aspects and rulerships and places and so on that kind of enter the astrological lexicon, which was before that a very pictographic and nonlinear language of night. So this is just something to think about when you look at all this. All this to say, Poseidon had a good reason to be angry. He was being devalued. But what we can see the connection with Neptune is that he does represent the deep unconscious. He does represent this sort of nonlinear world. But we have to consider that his situation is he's totally devalued. What he's offering is totally devalued. If you want to get a good sense of Neptune in this way, you could take a look at the Odyssey. The Odyssey is, of course, the story of Odysseus being, stranded at sea for 10 years on his way back from the Trojan War. It should have taken 6 weeks. It took 10 years. And who do you think cursed him to do that? It was Poseidon. It was Neptune. But what happens to him on that trip is a series of fantastical encounters with monsters, with the various versions of the divine feminine, with various, like the lotus eaters who are basically taking drugs to forget everything, right? Sound familiar with Neptune? With all, as I said, all these manifestations of the divine feminine, with Edenic spaces that were like just full of glamour and beauty, with a witch who turns people into animals, so transmutation. They're all Neptune themes. That's the way to enter, I think, for understanding the modern Neptune and creatively interfacing that with mythology. Because you'll hear people say, well, that's got nothing to do with Poseidon, but actually the whole Odyssey was a creation of Neptune. And what is the Odyssey, right? The Odyssey is being lost at sea on the journey home. Okay. All right, enough of that. So here he doesn't have quite the lovely role. Here, instead of encountering, so Demeter's wandering. Let's go back to our story. I feel like I'm back in that where did it all begin thing of Roberto. But what happens next is that Demeter's wandering looking for her daughter. And instead of wandering into Hecate or Helios, she actually runs into Neptune. But Neptune is not helpful. Neptune actually has designs on her and wants to have sex with her and eventually rapes her. However, so she's actually having happened to her what happens to her daughter with Pluto, right? There's a replication here. What's interesting is that she actually, in order to escape Neptune, and this is a curious choice, in order to escape Neptune, she becomes a mare. Now that is a strange thing to become if you're trying to escape the god who's associated with horses. Poseidon was the god of horses. So to escape the god of horses, she becomes a mare. That's curious, right? Remember, if you've ever seen images of like waves coming in as horses, or like in the Lord of the Rings, remember when the water, that's the association, right, of Neptune with horses. The galloping in of the waters. Here's another image of Neptune or Poseidon with Demeter as the mare. And so she has the same thing happen with Neptune. And I need to see what my next slide is there. Yeah, okay. So she has the same thing happen with Neptune that has happened to her daughter. And the result of this, well, there are a few things that happen. But at this point, the same thing happens. She is totally enraged that this has been done to her, of course. And she, again, locks herself away. But this time, she goes to a cave. She locks herself in a cave. She casts the world into famine, as in the other story. And she cannot be found, right? In Eleusis, there's no mystery about where Demeter is. We know where she is. She's in that temple that she had built for her. But yeah, exactly. It's a very weird move to do that. But we'll get to some of the psychological piece of why she might, of how that connects to what the psyche does when it is in a wandering state of grief due to psychic shock. So she can't be found. She's nowhere to be found. But ultimately, guess who finds her? We're in Arcadia, and it's Pan. You probably know Pan. He's a satyr. He's part goat, part human, but a demigod. And Pan is wild. Pan is crazy. Pan represents the untamed body, the instinctual life, right? And Pan finds her. Wildness finds her. You have to be wild to find her in this situation. He's known as greedy and desirous. He's not very in control. And he is a being of almost like a pure being of nature. I love this image of him coming to her. And instead of Hermes, who's more of a wordsmith helping Demeter come out of this situation, it's Pan. And you can see here, Pan has a warm energy. He's not a word person. He's a touch person. And there's something about this thing about touch that helps her come out of this, right? This is a more somatic, unarticulated. It's not about words that are going to take you out of this type of grief. When you've gone through the replication, it's something else. And she comes out of this thanks to Pan. He draws her out. She goes to the Lidonis River. This is an actual picture of the Lidonis River in Greece. And she bathes and she pacifies her grief. She washes it all away. She has to go and deal with the fates. She goes and has a conversation with the fates. Now, the fates are interesting. They spin out your life, you might remember. There are three of them. One of them measures the thread. One of them spins. One of them measures the thread. One of them cuts the thread. No one can defeat the fates. The fates have more power than any of the gods. They decide how things work. And that's the thing that Jennifer has to come to terms with. She has to face that this is all part of the fate, her fate and her daughter's fate. This is part of it. She has to face them. This is, I think, a very powerful image of in this case, it's actually chastity, a personification of chastity that's down, that's the fates are over here. And Zeus has called them to help her come to terms with this, right? She has to really deal with that. Now, that would be the end of the story, because at this point, we're back to the same negotiations and the same outcome in terms of Persephone being allowed to be in the upper world and then in the underworld, the same thing. But there are two other outcomes of this Arcadian myth that I think are very important. One of them is a very haunting figure that is said to have been born as a result of the mating of Poseidon, of the rape of Demeter by Poseidon. And this is called Despoina. Despoina is not a name. It just means the lady. She's never named a myth. She was worshipped, though, in Lycosaura in Arcadia, where this myth takes place. And she was known as the one who directed this. She was known as the mistress, but her name was unspeakable. So something is given rise to that is unspeakable, a kind of haunting figure. Often she's only pictured as that veil you see on the right, just this veil covered with animals. She's said to have known things, and that she tells the tale and leads the mysteries in Lycosaura. So it's a very different kind of energy. There's a ghost-like quality, a kind of haunting figure that this Despoina is. I have felt the presence of Despoina with many people that I work with who have what I would call unwitnessed trauma, ungrieved trauma, implicit. We'll get more to that. And one of the most interesting things is that in Lycosaura, where she was worshipped, there was a two-way mirror. There was a mirror And it was said that when you looked into the mirror, you didn't see your reflection, you saw Despoina, right? And this is frequently the case, that when people who have this type of trauma, where it has been not verbalized and they haven't been helped to grieve it and get through it, they actually, whenever they look at the mirror, they see the trauma, right? They see that, they don't see their full self. And the other being that was given birth to is actually a very different figure, Arion, the horse. And this isn't spoken of much, but what we know about Arion is that he's very full of vitality, speed, and was known as a very victorious steed. You know, I often think of him as Shadowfax, the white horse that Gandalf rides in The Lord of the Rings. You know, he's just like an archetypal embodiment of hoarseness and of the capacity of what horses can do, their vitality, their life, and also their sensitivity. And so these two were also a part of the mysteries, Despoina and Arion at Lycosaura. Lycosaura, this is actual runs from Lycosaura that I took when I was there. Lycosaura was interesting because in their temple and in their rites, sacrifices were done in a very different way. Normally, you do a sacrifice in a relatively humane way of slitting an animal's throat. But in Lycosaura, when they did these rites for Demeter, they actually would tear apart the animal limb from limb. Now, that is a gruesome way to do it. And it's incredibly powerful way to go through this, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But Lycosaura was known as a kind of bloody place. Again, Arcadia is kind of wild, right? These things are not conducted in a sort of organized, sophisticated way of Eleusis. They are in a very, very different way. And so, let's see. I lost my page. Let me just go here. So let's talk about this Arcadian way and what it might mean. And to me, this is a very different way of grieving. If the Eleusinian is about a story that is conscious and accompanied, the Arcadian way is about collisions with the deep unconscious, relational collisions. And this relates profoundly to therapeutic processes, and we'll get to why. In the wake of the loss of innocence, one wanders, exiled from self, alone and split off and unalive. So there's Demeter's wandering that is in both stories. But now, instead of running into Hecate and Helios again, experiences constellate with others which mirror the original loss or violation. This happens, right? When you've had a trauma or something like that, it tends to keep replicating if it hasn't been processed, right? In other words, for instance, the person who has learned to think of themselves as a victim walks around and will tend to attract it. It's sort of like basic attractor theory in complexity science, right? That once the attractor is there, the A-B attractor. So if A was, I was raped, B was, I felt victimized, then I walk around as a B feeling victimized, which pulls in A, the attack again. This is a very natural thing that happens. You could see this as a healing instinct, though, that something's trying to happen, that we're trying to get a different outcome. Freud might have called this repetition compulsion, although it's a slightly different concept. But experiences will constellate with others which mirror the original loss or violation. This is what happens when we have not gotten to symbolize and been helped with our trauma and been witnessed, key thing, right? We're talking about unwitnessed trauma, unwitnessed losses, moments where you don't get that help. These experiences are consciously avoided. So they're trying to get away, but unconsciously the person sets them up. Think about Demeter becoming a mare. That's what's really interesting here, right? Like, she is consciously trying to avoid Neptune. Unconsciously, you'd have to say it's the opposite. I mean, you became a horse. Experiences that happen then activate these reservoirs of affect, which leads to overwhelming emotional enactments. So let me say what I mean by that. Enactments is something that I will say in relationally oriented psychotherapy, for instance, we'll say that the client and I are in an enactment when the client's material actually pulls me into the vortex of acting out whatever happened to them. Not, let's say it's sexual trauma, not, of course, having sexual trauma with them, but in some way, we end up in the same replication, in a fractal of the experience. Maybe they are the perpetrator and I am the victim. Maybe they act that out towards me, or the other way around. But enactments happen which have emotional impact. This isn't just with therapy, of course, though. People will do this in their relationships, in their dating situations, and all of that kind of thing. And when this happens, there's a sense of futility and deprivation. The only choice becomes to freeze. And this is the freeze response that we talk about a lot in trauma, where you don't, your natural desire to process through or to emote or do whatever you need to do gets frozen into winter. So another kind of contact is required to unfreeze. So this is where the freezing that has happened in this, and she's unlocatable, right, in the cave. It's not like Eleusis where she's locatable and Hermes can come and say some things. In this case, the healing person who comes along is not Hermes, it's Pan, who is very embodied. He's wild. He's natural. It's not going to be through a simple relationship that this is going to work. It's going to have to be a little bit wild. This is my experience of working with deep trauma, is that this is something that needs to happen. Things need to be reconstellated. People need to lose control, and things get reworked. However, there's a possibility for healing in it, but it is going to look a little bit wilder. It won't work to just talk about it. That's not going to happen. These are deep implicit trauma. I'll come back to this. A deep cleansing and mourning becomes possible when Pan comes, because it has loosened, it has unfrozen, right? The contact with wildness has unfrozen. You can go to the returnative forces of life itself. This is Demeter Louisa. Yes, anybody can have my slides, just write to me after. This is Demeter Louisa, means the pacified Demeter, by the way. And behind the scenes, there are these profoundly creative forces that have been born as a result of all this. One of them is parts of self that hold the loss and trauma, like Despoina. And the other is parts of self with gifts and powers that have been enlivened, like Arion. So what this says to us is that these parts have to be embraced at the same time. These are both children of the trauma. It won't be enough just to try to get Arion and leave Despoina behind. They come together. You will be rescuing and dealing with her who carries the trauma and the loss. You'll also be, as a result, you will recover your vitality and power. That's the possibility of the journey to the trauma, of being able to enact it and symbolize it and move through it, right? And then again, the entrance into the deep mysteries becomes possible, right? It's an initiation into sacred embodiment. That is really what happens here. If we look at these two paths, the Eleusinian way is about losses that you can metabolize with help, right? You have greater internal coping capacity, you have integrative resources, you have interpersonal support in that story. This is the kind of grief that's explicit, it's consciously recognized. So think about something like 9/11. Most people will have the Eleusinian way with 9/11 who were there, not all, but most will have it, in part because a lot of people heard about it. A lot of people can validate it. It was seen. We all went through it together in a certain way, right? But there will be some people whose inner experience will not get validated, and they'll end up in the Arcadian path with it for sure. But most people will be able to do it in a different way. It will be expressed and symbolized and relationally mediated, right? This is one way, and this is some traumas and some losses work this way, and some Ceres processes work this way. But the other way they work is the Arcadian myth for sure, where it cannot be metabolized you don't have it in you to metabolize it. It's often what we might call early losses or pre-verbalized. It's not my favorite word, but because it's not about words, it's more just about early things that you don't have the resources and you don't get the external help. Think about child abuse as a really good example of this, right? Where most children have no way to have that witnessed. No way to have a benevolent help with that. That's most people go through it that way. Most children in this large world of many people without the resources that probably most of us have access to. If you work in a place like I work in New Mexico, where there's enormous amounts of child abuse and poverty, then these are people who don't have any of those resources available. And many of us also who were sexually abused, we know this space of the unmetabolizable, right? You cannot digest it, right? It doesn't go through you. There's no interpersonal assistance, there's interpersonal violation, and it is unwitnessed. So the grief becomes implicit. Rather than being consciously recognized and symbolized, it's dissociated and split off, right? Here's this experience. There's a wild, untamed quality to it. It's overwhelming. It resides in the deep unconscious, and then it has to be relationally enacted and repeated. So it keeps on repeating. You keep on getting into the same fucking relationships over and over again, right? You keep on having the same violations, the same problems. This is relationally enacted and repeated. Hopefully, well, let's see, where did I go? Oh, this is just something to say about the Pan. I don't know how this got here, but Hermes speaks to her, but Pan touches her, right? Who's going to help her through? But we're going to need those wild encounters. Now, the hopeful thing is in this tendency to have these replications, the possibility exists that it could actually end up going differently, right? One of the things that I'm working with in astrology, that I'm using astrology for in my own work, I want to help two things with astrology. One is I want to help a person know the dream they're in. What is the myth that I'm in? Where am I? What mythology am I in, right? And the chart helps us to locate what is the myth that I'm in. And to get that at a somatic level, so not just in an intellectual way, but actually to feel into the dream. That's why, again, astrodrama, psychodrama, work with people's direct emotional lives. Those things really help us feel the myth, right? Feel what it's like for Ceres to, I mean, can you imagine, right? Your daughter has been taken away and raped, and then someone comes along and does the same thing to you. Right? This innocent part of yourself in childhood that happened to, and now it keeps happening in your adulthood too, right? These are terrible experiences to go through. And as a result, when people can actually, though, drop into that and feel into the myth that they're in, that's the one thing I want to do with astrology. And then the other is, if you're in the dreaming field of the myth, of the chart, it's not just intellectual. You don't look for solutions with your intellect and say, okay, well, this one's coming here, and so that means I need to X, Y, Z, and that's how I'll solve the problem. That's totally valid. It's just that it's a daytime approach, and frankly speaking, daytime approaches are pretty much useless when it comes to this level of trauma that I'm talking about. The daytime material won't work. It's cognitive behavioral therapy, you know, reprogram your brain, think differently. That stuff's great, but it won't work for the one on the right-hand side here. It can actually help a lot with the left-hand side. Not going to help with the right-hand side of the slide, I mean. What is helpful is actually being in the field of it, being in the actual constellated field that is described here in the Arcadian process. And so after we get into the field of the dream, then I want to help the person redream it, reimagine what could it be, what might it become. And we find ourselves sourcing other mythologies that are connected, or we find ourselves dreaming. We find ourselves just letting ourselves dream the archetypes onward. I mean, after all, these are only two versions of this story. There are many, many more in ancient Greece and Rome of this story. And guess what? We can also come up with new ones ourselves. But again, it won't be from the mental. It'll be from the felt sense. You can't dream through your brain. You'll have to dream through your body to imagine another way. So this field was constellated for me with a client that I want to talk about. And it's a personal story for me too, because it's definitely a moment of empathic failure on my part. And you know, moments of empathic failure are everybody's destiny. So if you don't think you have them, they're coming to you in a minute now. And they probably happen every day with your partner. They certainly have with the people who've been in the privilege and terror of a relationship with me. So back to this story. So this is a chart of a woman that I worked with who came to me in her 30s. She came to me, some of the background here is that there was bulimia. I'll just say Pluto Ceres, right? Doesn't that say to you purging and binging, right? Like that's, you know, Ceres is the goddess of the grain. Pluto has a purging quality. You can feel how that would happen. Second house also is a part of it. And also Libran process, which indicates a pendulation between the opposites, right? So bulimia is a very literal sort of, you know, way to think about this particular combination. It's not the only way, of course. There's also was a drug abuse issue. I would say there are many places we could locate it, but because it was addiction lives everywhere in the chart. Don't believe people when they're like, oh, it's Neptune or Pluto and that's it, you know, whatever. No. Any pattern can be repeated into the point of addiction. Any planetary archetype can be, you can be addictively running it without any involvement of an outer planet. For sure, seen it a million times. Neptune conjunct the moon, though, is where I would go on this one. I just now saw somebody said astrology greater than CBT. Yeah, I think so too. So Neptune conjunct the moon, in this case, I think spoke to the drug use because it was very escape oriented. So in that case, that makes sense to me. And it's trying to restore. Again, you'll see one of the ways I look at Sagittarius is very towards an overly hyperbolic kind of optimism that can constellate there when Sagittarius is in shadow. And so this was an attempt to escape and you know, make things there. Relatively psychically fragmented. So that's where you see the sun in square to the Uranus-Chiron opposition. CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy, someone asked. So you'll see the sun square the Uranus-Chiron opposition. That would be one signature, certainly, of psychic fragmentation, you could imagine. And she also feels like there's memories of sexual abuse, not sure, lots of traumatic sequelae. What I mean by that is she had a lot of the things that people have when you've had sexual trauma, right? She would see her father's face on people that were scary to her. She would have night terrors. She would have sort of flashbacks, but nothing really clear. She would have strange somatic experiences with her body and sensations. These are all sort of things that as a Hecate figure, I'm sort of hearing the story from her body, but I don't know what's happened, and I can't presume to know what this constellation of symptoms means. Just like you can't presume to know, what this constellation of planets in a chart means. You have to kind of listen longer and let it reveal itself to you. You don't just get to jump in and say, this is this and this and that. If you're doing that, I think you're probably missing a lot, and possibly oversimplifying and misleading. So we're hanging out with these memories for her, right? The first couple of years, by the way, the sexual abuse stuff you could certainly see with Uranus and Scorpio opposite Chiron and Taurus. Those are both highly, and in the 8th house, those are very potentially sexual abuse material, right? And so to see those paired together, to see 8th house, Scorpio, Taurus, 2nd house, these things linked together with Uranus, Chiron would say, okay, sexual issues which are connected to fragmentation. Again, one of the things I want to say about this is, like, problem with case study in astrology is that when we're spelling it all out like this, it sounds like it was just like, oh yeah, all that was right, right there. Of course not. It comes in very nonlinear ways and comes over time, and it's a bit of a violation. It's a little bit like I'm actually doing right now what I said the ego does to dreams, right? Like the dream is all over the place. In the morning, the ego narrates it in a nice straight line. I'm doing the same thing. I'm narrating to you in a linear fashion the dream of our therapy together. So here we are in the Uranus opposite Chiron square to the sun. I think you can feel into that. You can also feel how it would undermine coherence. The sun, in my way of thinking about astrology, is the coherence factor. The sun coheres the solar system. It holds the solar system in place. So the solar function is a coherence function. It's also a healthy narcissistic function that allows me to say the word I. And holds everything, all this multiplicity of who I am is held into a unified one thing. So if it is T-squared this way by these two very fragmenting planets, you can imagine it was hard for her to have that healthy I, especially with Sun in Leo really has a power of coherence. No one can quite pronounce who they are like a Leo, but in this chart, it's very much undermined, and indeed she was. The first couple of years, like I said, were touch and go. It was very slowly. And our first contact was when Uranus and Pluto were stimulating the nodes and Pluto and Ceres. So remember when there was the Uranus-Pluto squaring between Capricorn and Aries? So that was hitting the nodes and Ceres and Pluto when we first started working together. We also started working under a Ceres retrograde in Gemini within a day of the retrograde station. That was within a day of the exact Sun Ceres opposition. So during, outer planets, anything from the Earth out, right, it always retrogrades when it's across from the Sun. And at the midpoint of the retrograde is always the exact opposition to the Sun. So when we met, that had just happened in the sky, right? So I always look at the consultation, the initial chart for therapy, always, in the same way that Jungians will take the first dream very seriously. The initial chart could be said to be the very first dream of the therapy. So we're going to look at that for sure. So I was careful with supporting her. It's very touch and go. She's very, needs a lot of careful connection. One of the things that with a moon, Neptune conjunction in the 4th house, that's pretty highly sensitive, very on the lookout, very sensitized. And so one of the things I think about in therapy is that we have to be sort of moon whisperers. You have to whisper to the moon, and the moon has to feel like the moon's so cratered, isn't it? And so all those contours and craters, if you really want someone who's in their lunar state to feel felt, you have to kind of contour in, and they have to know that you get all those contours, and then they can kind of relax. We're all like that in our lunar self, right? And so, and if the lunar self isn't, I tend to think the lunar self has to be dealt with first in therapeutic process, because if the lunar self doesn't feel safe, there's no progress anywhere else. So it takes time, and it did. I felt the need to be careful about entering the trauma too rapidly. The possibility of overwhelm was very clear, and that could lead to more drug use and bulimia, right? I know that there's a door that's, here's what she said. I know that there's a door that is sealed so tightly shut for some reason, and I can't explain how scared I become when I get close to it, other than to say the possibility of hating my existence or fantasizing about killing myself is a less fearful option than opening the door to that. So hear that again, right? Like this is again someone who's like not wanting to go to that underworld and face that, right? It's like I'll go anywhere. I'll die first. I mean, it's a different kind of underworld, but I'll die first before I open that door, right? I mean, this is a very powerful statement to me also of a South Node in Aries in the 8th house that's willing to go through fucking hell in order to not have to go down there to that Pluto-Ceres North Node conjunction. Right? I do not want to have to visit that land, right? And who can blame her? When you hear about this, and I'm not going to give a lot of details because of vicarious trauma, but so she, as our work went on and she was doing that, she went for an ayahuasca event in Peru, which was very important. I think, you know, she went to it, I think, hoping that it was going to be the magical cure. But it was not that. But it was absolutely very powerful. And it was during a Ceres retrograde over the T-square in her chart. So Ceres retrograde, as I described in the other chart, in that chart, because it was on the Eleusinian path, that chart, the retrograde almost had this reprieve quality, right? It sort of facilitated a denial. But we're going to look at retrograde here in a very different way as a rupturing of implicit material and traumatic material. Retrograde actually often characterizes the Arcadian way. And retrograde happens about 4 months a year for Ceres. Retrograded over her T-square. She went for ayahuasca. And what happened in the ayahuasca was not about resolving the trauma and all that, but it was recognizing this intense control pattern that she had run. And she returned 2 months later. And again, Ceres is still, you know, affecting this T-square. Actually, I don't think that's right. Let me see. No, it's affecting the nodal axis, right? It was on the T-square, now it's gotten to the nodes, right? And she 2 months later returned, and she suddenly, after the work we've been doing that imagines that might have to do with the father and the sexual abuse, she out of nowhere one day texts her father and says, "I know what you did." Right? Which, you know, is a day that will live in infamy, right? I mean, that's a powerful moment, right? You text him too. I think it was kind of a fabulous thing. We are then began to do some anger work. Mars comes over the T-square and joins Ceres, which is fabulous for activating that anger function. And this, though, is when the collision happens. So collision, what I mean by collision is that the way of the Arcadian path is you collide with the deep unconscious, like she collided with Poseidon, right? Like Demeter collided with Poseidon. You do not, you know, consciously figure it out and all that. It's like, boom. And so this happened. And what happened is that her father, when he got the text, responded with a quite remarkable letter that covered every single base. And, you know, it was the perfect letter to write, rather too perfect. If you've been around this type of sociopathy, which was, I think, a correct statement for this individual, so lacking empathy, like a narcissistic process, but also lacking remorse. Narcissistic process does not lack remorse. Once a narcissistic person understands what they've done, they will feel terrible. But sociopathic, that doesn't notice that at all. And so, and I don't know if somebody asked about chart signatures. For narcissism, I have lots of different stories to be told in the chart. There's no one signature, of course. By the way, partly, there's never a signature for any particular mental illness. I've never really seen any convincing empirical material on that. And also, there are a million ways to tell these different stories, right? Actually, astrology is much more sophisticated than modern psychology. So if we go using the psychological terms and then go to look for pointers in the chart about them, we have simplified astrology to a very primitive language of psychology that's only been around for 150 years. Ours has been around for thousands of years. We have a much more nuanced understanding of the psyche that is possible, at least, from astrology. So astrological this equals psychological that, in my experience, is unhelpful. What I want to do is find out what the story is, right? There's a bipolar, just to give you an example, there's a bipolar story that's about Libra, that's about going back and forth between extremes. There's bipolar stories that are about Uranus, Mercury, things where your thought processes are speeded up. There's bipolar stories that are about Uranus squared the moon. There are all different myths and stories that describe people's unique experience of these seemingly same disorders. And that's what we want to do is multiply and nuance the understanding. All right, I've gotten a little off track. But to come back then to this experience, he writes this letter, and it is so perfect. It's perfect in the way that only a sociopath can do. And I think most people will know what I mean by that. If not, try a book like The Sociopath Next Door or something. That's actually a book. But it will describe this capacity to kind of like just cover it all. It was totally... So we get this letter, she shares this letter with me, but something happens that's very unprecedented for me in my own practice, which is I would normally see right through this and be with the client. She came in saying, this is nonsense, I'm upset, this thing is sick to my stomach. But in that moment, I actually became equivocated about the trauma. This is me who has been for 2 years supporting the client and validating her own experience and actually really helping her to claim this. And now in the presence of this letter, I sort of freeze and can't get on board. I didn't say this didn't happen or he's right or anything like that, but I just kind of went into a inability to join her in this. I can actually feel the dissociation in my body right now. I can feel how I left, right? Just right now. Probably some of you can feel it too, because dissociation is contagious. So we'll come back in. Wow, it's powerful. So, because, by the way, sociopathy induces dissociation. This is why people deny that terrible, horrible things do happen. That there's such a thing as ritual abuse. There's such a thing as people being kept in their basements and all that shit. It's real, right? But we tend to want to dissociate from that type of sociopathy and not see that or know about that. But having worked with a lot of that type of trauma, I have learned not to do that. So if we come back to the body, I had left mine, could not be there for her. She leaves in a total upset. On that exact day, her progressed Pluto was exactly conjunct her natal Ceres. Now that's only going to happen once in your life, right? Pluto moves very slowly by progression. On that exact day, when that collision happened between us, a total rupture, she left the therapy. She didn't want to be in therapy. She got up and left, and I don't blame her. And I didn't blame her even then. I didn't understand. Why can't I, what's going on here, right? And so I had to open up to my own wildness. And this is actually my chart that's on the outer wheel, and that's hers, of course. And you can see we have some really potent overlaps. We have my Sun Pluto on her Pluto Ceres. You can also see there's a Neptune Ceres conjunction going on here, which is pretty important to this story because it is a Neptune Ceres replication, right? She's going through it again. The thing that she said to me was, you're doing the same thing they all did when I told them about this, right? You're denying my experience. We're in the reenactment entirely. And it was clear to me, though, that she had always been in this mare way. She frequently tried to induce me into believing that none of this had happened, right? She frequently tried to have me go into the reenactment. The reenactment was not me as the perpetrator. It was me as the denying witness, by the way. I haven't been clear about that. The reenactment that is happening there, right, is me saying, essentially, this didn't happen, which is what people said to her in school. It's what her family said. Everybody said this didn't happen. Because she suddenly was remembering, oh my God, I do remember that this happened. And I tried to tell people, right? Yes, I am having my Ceres return. I know. That's why I picked this, actually. Yeah, I thought that was pretty cool, too. And a little bit overwhelming. So this same retrograde that was affecting her T-square is also naturally affecting mine. So I had my own experience. So what happened to me is that day I was totally stunned by what had happened between us. I went upstairs and I found a journal in my journals. I don't know why I went to it. I just went right to it. And I discovered in that journal a whole series of dreams that I had had of being sexually abused, which I did not know before that moment. And I didn't know whether to take these dreams seriously. I didn't remember ever having had these dreams. I later saw that I had been getting up for 6 months before and writing these dreams in a journal and then hiding the journal even from myself, having a whole separate dream journal that I was recording dreams in, not knowing this other one was there. And by the way, this all happened for me while my progressed Mercury was retrograde over my Venus. And so you can imagine that's like this weird sort of revelatory process that unsticks something that was held in Scorpio Venus, right? So that's another example of Mercury's facilitating role. So there's all my journaling of dreams, secret journaling of dreams. I mean, it's doubly removed, right? It's like it's in a dream, but also you hid the dream from yourself until the client collision allowed us to come forward, right? During a Ceres retrograde over our shared T-squares. All right, that's a lot of talk. During this, all of the Ceres was retrograde, so was Pluto. Pluto was within 1 degree of Ceres. in this. And we began our sessions again because once I realized what had happened and I was in touch with my own wildness, my own my own total overwhelm that this had happened to me. I mean, this has been a healing process for me over the last few years, as you can imagine. And I'm not a highly dissociative person. I was very fortunate to have this all validated. All these dreams were validated by my family members who kept the secret forever, right? It's this kind of thing. And I wrote a letter to her and said, you know, I have completely let you down. I have totally failed you. But I want to repair it. And I think that's what's different, that makes me different from your people who denied it earlier in your life. And we can dream this differently. I didn't use that language at that point. That would have felt, I think, very, not very attuned. But I absolutely was able to acknowledge this to her. And we began our sessions again. And I realized as I was researching this, that Ceres went direct the day that we began our sessions again, right? That all happened in a 4-month retrograde, all that stuff where she texts her father, we do the anger work, the letter comes, I respond to the letter poorly, we rupture therapy, and then we re-begin at Ceres direct. Yeah, really amazing. And for us in our therapy, this was pivotal, right? You can only imagine, I mean, pivotal, right? Both that betrayal, but the wildness, the touch that happened, and metaphorically, there's touch between us. We collided, right? We didn't just talk about the trauma. We entered it together. This happens in therapy a lot. It's not always quite this dramatic, but it happens a lot in really deep therapy. You enter the field, the implicit field. And the retrogrades really bring that out with Ceres. Now, I'm aware of the time, but I want to say a couple more things. Things went on. She became more capable of a relationship. The trauma got processed, you know, and really, it's kind of a miracle story, beautiful story. So I want to say a few things really quick and then I open it up because I don't want to deny the voices here. Not the ones in my head, the ones in the chat. I often have to deny the voices in my head. So Ceres transits to me indicate that it's time for a deeper embodiment, a greater degree of incarnation of the area that's been transited. That will demand that the affected area be brought down to earth in some way through loss, depression, or somehow showing up in the body. Think of the illnesses with my client, the first one. There's a call coming from the psyche from a place that has been harmed or violated or lost. Narcissistic identifications in whatever area it's transiting will be challenged. And the evolutionary forward, I think, is the willingness to go through it all. Symbols of the Arcadian way, because I want to just name that. In my experience, they are especially likely when Ceres is retrograde or in quadrature aspect, quadrature meaning conjunctions, squares, and oppositions, to Pluto, the nodes, or the moon, natally or by transit. Also, Ceres retrograde periods over significant configurations. So think about how these T-squares were activated for her and me by the retrograde. The retrograde seems to bring this dramatic shadow material up. And by the way, we're about to go retrograde in 2 days. So this will be interesting for all of us. It brings the dramatic acceleration of shadow material and seem to correlate to the demand to acknowledge darkness and loss rather than to ignore it, right? And places where the natural cycle of life and death has been frozen, where the myth has been stuck, they tend to be very dramatically affected and move us towards the next part of the story or season. I'm going to name this too. The U.S. is on an Arcadian path for sure with regard to Ceres. It was retrograde when the U.S. election happened with Trump. And at the time of his announcement, it was also retrograde and it was his Ceres return. His natal Ceres is retrograde. But what do we see happen, you know, in the logic of this experience that we're all going through is there's a lot of retrograde, meaning a lot of implicit material is being pulled to the surface. It was opposite Pluto in a grand trine with 3 stationing planets and the sun in his natal chart. His Ceres conjuncts the U.S. South Node. The U.S. natal Ceres is a stationary retrograde Ceres. It's stationary. That's like impact point, right? And by progression, it was at 0 degrees Aries for both his announcement and election by progression in the U.S. chart, right? It was at the Aries point. So we are in an interesting Ceresian moment. And I'll say this one more thing. I think of Ceres, I think of the 4 goddesses that were the asteroids, now Ceres is a planet, as rulers of the different elements. Ceres to me as the Earth Trinity. And I'll just read this and then we can stop for questions. I know we have just 10 minutes, but as ruler of the Earth Trinity, Ceres is a deeply embodying force. Fire must yield to Earth. We must come into incarnation, into the cyclical realities of death and loss that life on Earth entails. In a deeply personal way, we must own our own story subject to earthly life. The paradox, and this is the mysteries, right? It's the beautiful thing. Excuse me. The paradox is that through this total commitment to incarnation, we are able to harvest the wisdom and spiritual perspective that is timeless and not subject to precisely these limitations. Right? This is an immanence path and not a transcendent path. This is the spiritual path to me of the Earth Trinity, a path of immanence rather than transcendence. This is the threshold to mystery that Ceres compels us to cross when the planet grasps us. I think I'll stop there and invite your questions or comments, however this might work. And so I guess, Adam, are you going to kind of narrate or facilitate, or how shall we proceed? Uh-oh. Maybe it's on me.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, I can. Yeah, I guess I could just type it into the chat box, right? I didn't think about that. Okay. Now I can't hear you if you're trying to be heard, Adam. I don't hear you anymore, but I heard you for a moment.
Okay, yep, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I can, sorry, hold on just a second. Now, do you want me to put, did you want me to screen share? Is that what you were, I'm sorry, what were you asking me to do?
Oh, no, I wanted to give time for questions. I was just wondering how we do it. I do see one, I guess we just go from the chat and.
Yeah, oh, I see, yeah, yes. If there's questions in the chat box that were asked earlier and did not get seen, you can feel free to re-ask that now in the chat box and we can go back to it. I don't see any.
I see two things.
Oh yeah, there's. Yeah.
I'll go ahead and address those maybe.
Okay, great.
So Chiron and Ceres relationship that someone asked, the resonance, and where I go with that, this is a little bit of my own cosmology with astrology, which is under development. One of my passions is about taking some of the material from Hellenistic world that has come forward and that is often used in non-psychological ways. In fact, some people are kind of anti-psychological who are doing that, and that's fine. They've got their own work. But I have a huge passion for psychologizing the Hellenistic revival and bringing that into that. So for instance, with zodiacal releasing, I like to think of it as moments when the self states that are shown by the different planets are forward and recede. That's a way I use zodiacal releasing, is how do self states, meaning states in ourselves that are shown by different planetary configurations, how do they come forward and recede as different signs are highlighted in releasing, as an example. Another place though is around sect theory. And sect in traditional astrology or Hellenistic astrology is mostly used for planetary condition assessment, right? To determine who wins, who loses, who's contrary, how malefic is it, how benefic is it. All useful things, not my interest. My interest is more to sort of think about sect as day and night qualities that exist in every person. And we all have day parts of our chart and night parts of our chart. We have houses, we have planets. There's a night team of planets, Moon, Venus, Mars. There's a day team of planets. Okay, that's a lot. And then there's twilight. And twilight, Mercury is connected to twilight. As I said, Mercury can only be viewed in a twilight sky, right? Only in dawn and dusk, and only for a few minutes. Is neither of the night nor of the day inherently. To me, the other twilight beings are Chiron and Ceres. If I were to go through the planets that are not part of the ancient pantheon, I would give night to Pluto and Neptune, I would give day to Uranus and Eris, and I would give twilight to the Chiron and Ceres. I would see them as twilight bodies. And partly that's because of their association with Virgo, and I am an astrologer who makes links between house, sign, and planet. It's not that I am not aware that that's not how they rose up over time, but I think there are resonances there that really are meaningful. So all that to say, Ceres and Chiron both have a relationship with Virgo. And Ceres, of course, is through the constellational image of Virgo, which is one of them was held to be Ceres. And Chiron has often been seen as having affinities with Virgo and with affinities with the sixth house. To me, they link together in that way, and they link together also in the notion of limitation. And here they link up with Saturn too, right? Is that all of these archetypes, as earthy archetypes, they insist on limitation. They insist on incarnation and all that entails. So Chiron is this, for me, is often a wound that you don't get to transcend or get over. And in the same way, Ceres refers to losses and traumas that you can work through, but they bring you into your earthly body. And Chiron to me does the same thing. Like as Chiron goes into Aries right now, my whole interest is in the return to the instinctual body between Aries and the centaur itself. So that's my link for Chiron and centaur, or Chiron and Ceres. So it feels like there was something else, and I saw it up there. Oh yeah, the scythe, Ceres as the scythe. Yeah, that's really interesting. And of course, both Saturn and Ceres look like scythes. You know, Saturn, you know, if we accept the notion of glyphs as having all being, the traditional planets all being composed of crescents, circles, and crosses, right? Spirit, soul, matter. Then you get that with Saturn. You get, or I should do it, I don't know. Anyway, you get that with Saturn. Scythe-ish looking thing, and Ceres also. But Ceres is also the scythe simply because she's the goddess of the grain. You can see her holding one right here. And so her glyph looks like that too, because that's how you harvest things. But I also agree with you. This can also be connected to the Grim Reaper mythology, as can the Saturn scythe as well, right? Both of them have that. Again, they are not unlike, but you won't find the kinds of stories with Saturn that you'll find with Ceres that I was just describing. I mean, it's not the same type of insistence on limitation and embodiment. It's a different kind. The two snakes is another question that I see up there. You know, honestly, I haven't really dreamt into the snakes. I mean, certainly we know that snakes have a lot of different symbolic properties in Greek consciousness. They are considered to be healing. They're considered to be prophetic. They are seen as the bearers of transformation. All of those are part of them. Maybe most crucially, they were associated with healing, with Asclepius, with the temples where you would go and reside with the snakes. And they were also associated with prophecy, such as the Pythia. But I haven't quite dreamt into that myself. So I think that would be interesting to play with. There's just so much, there's so much we can look at. And right, someone just pointed out that it's also medicine. And certainly that's the connection with Asclepius and the dream incubation temples, right? Where you went in to, this is actually relevant for Ceres, because you went into the dream, if you wanted healing, you went to an Asclepion, which is a dreaming temple, and you laid on the earth would send you a dream, and you would say the dream to the priest, and he would know what to do to help you heal. And Ceres and Gaia at one point earlier on were the same, right? They're both personifications of the earth. And it was Gaia who would send the prophecies up through the earth into your body. As you lay there, the dreams would be sent into your body, right? It's a beautiful myth. And you would then metabolize that dream with the assistance, the relational mediation of the priest, right? So there is a link there, I suppose, with that, because the snakes lived in I haven't said the snake part, the snakes lived in there. But I think there's much more we could say with that. I imagine I've only touched the surface, because certainly we also know that the snakes are connected to the Adi, to the chakra system, and there are notions in Greece and Mesopotamia of the chakra system too, not just in India. Yeah, and incorporated aspects of the psyche, I could see that for the snakes for sure, especially because they're pulling the chariot. It's your complexes that actually lead you to your journey of Demeter, right? So if they're pulling the chariot, that's an interesting point. I like that. I also would say, the Ouroboros maybe, but the Ouroboros is one snake, and remember too that the snakes appear on the caduceus. This is one too. I'll just share because we're loving on Mercury a little bit. The caduceus is super interesting, right? That's the healing staff with the snakes. And maybe there is some connection to Ceres that someone might make. The thing that was most interesting to me, Dorian Greenbaum, who has written on a lot of the daimon, she was quoting, I don't remember who, maybe it's Manilius, maybe it's Dorotheus, I don't know who, but she was quoting someone who wrote about the snakes in the caduceus, and that what they represent is that they're tied together at the base of the caduceus, and that is considered to be the knot of necessity. And then they come up and they are about to kiss at the top, and that's considered the kiss of Eros. And there's something about this play of those two that is about the healing process and it's also a mercurial process. The interesting thing to me is that the kiss is not consummated by the two snakes, right? So it keeps you in suspension, which is, Mercury kind of keeps you like that. Why I mention that is just with the two snakes in Ceres, one could certainly imagine somehow they've been liberated or they're headed there. I don't know. Anyway, something to dream about. Yes, there's a discovery chart for Ceres, and you could find it online pretty easy. Favorite book on Greco-Roman mythology. I would, the Colosso book that I mentioned really is if you know some of it already, so that wouldn't be the place to start. Well, I mean, the easiest things, of course, Edith Hamilton, very classic, but very simplistic. I like a lot of the Robert Graves material. I also like Edward Edinger, who's a Jungian and thinks about it from that perspective. Those are the ones that immediately come to mind. If you would like a bibliography, I have a very extreme bibliography with all sorts of books about all sorts of topics that I usually give to people. So feel free to contact me and I'd be glad to share that with you. And it's got a lot of myth books that are my favorites. So maybe we've reached there's something about Roman mythology that I missed. But I know we're at our time and I don't want to violate that. You said it was pretty hard stop. Should we stop here, Adam?
I think if we want to take maybe one last question or something like that, we could.
Okay. Well, I think this one that is up here is super interesting, which is talking about the fact that Ceres is joining the Saturn-Pluto material, which is, wow, I didn't actually know that. That is remarkable. It feels like that'll also be interesting because let me think about this. Let's see if that's happening that's happening in March, right? So no, that she won't be retrograde, but I do think it will be an interesting one to track because this would be a rupture point. I mean, to me, that would really bring a lot to. that would just bring so much forward. To me, that just sounds like an exclamation point on everything else we're saying about Saturn Pluto. That's probably what I would say to that. So I think I'm ready to stop. Uh-oh. Maybe I'm not allowed to.
Awesome.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Hold on just a second. Let me. Oh, here we go. All right, there we go. And let me just.
By the way, the flower that I've pinned to myself is actually dead, which I thought was kind of the way to go for this. It's actually it's wax flower, not a wax flower. It's wax flower. But I decided, I've let it actually. I knew I was going to be doing this talk, so I've held it in the house in the vase without water, and it feels a little bit like letting go of something.
Nice. This was such a nice talk, Jason. Thank you for just preparing it and being so thoughtful and also your enthusiasm is super contagious. I could feel it in the group, in myself, but in the group as well. So.
Oh, good. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for having me again. I really love it. I could feel it in the group too. And that sort of calls the best forth from us too, doesn't it? I mean, yeah.
Totally. I want to remind people of a few little announcements before we leave. If you have not already, although I have put it into the chat box, and by the way, at one point there was a few people that received a private message for the fundraising because somehow I couldn't figure out how to get the chat to send to everyone. So if you got that, it wasn't personal. I wasn't like, hey, you. So here is the link to donate. If you have not already, it's 15 to 25. Anything that you can do is fine if you can't do that. And if you can do more, please do, because there's lots of people here tonight who may not be able to afford very much or may not be able to afford donating at all, in which case, if you give more, it helps. And if you couldn't afford anything tonight, don't worry. Please come back again. Pay it forward by generously teaching others or giving more when you have more at a future astrology event or something like that. Again, the idea of the series is to make astrology accessible, to create community, to promote the work of other astrologers other than myself or my students, which I think is very important, and also, to serve astrologers, to really raise funds for astrologers who do this work, who do this research, and for all of you who are studying astrologers, remember to pitching in is essentially saying, this is valuable to me. I may use this in my practice. There's some insights I gained about Ceres tonight that, it may stick with you for years, and that's worth something. So at any rate, there's the link is in the box. I'm going to put it in one more time. There you go. And let's take a look at what's coming up for the rest of our series.
I know. Somebody pointed that out on the chat.
So on Saturday, Theodore Naker will be with us. I hope I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. He'll tell me if I'm not. But it's the Heart of Vedic Astrology on Saturday at noon Eastern Time. So I hope you guys can join us for that. The login information is on the events page. So you don't have to do anything other than just go to the page and click enter, and you'll be joining us on Saturday at noon. There's the events page in case you need it. And then Wednesday, April 17th, Adam Summer will be with us giving a talk about synodic cycles of Mercury, which should be interesting considering this Mercury retrograde cycle. And I consider myself, I do not consider myself a kind of alarmist about Mercury retrogrades. And, I don't freak out about them. But this one was, for me, was a doozy. And I've been getting the feedback from people that it was a doozy. It was a doozy for a lot of other people, too. Maybe that's because of Neptune, Neptune really strongly in the mix. Maybe Mercury is, particularly interesting. A lot of foot stuff going on. Pisces, like lots of feet stuff. Anyway, I digress. Check out these other talks. Thank you all for coming tonight so much. Really appreciate it. And thank you again, Jason, for leading us on an awesome adventure with Ceres tonight.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, you all take care. Yes. Okay. Good night, everybody.